There is a particular kind of Tuesday morning that exists only in communist East Germany, gray without apology. The sky pressing down on the rooftops like a lid on a pot. The streets full of people moving with their eyes forward and their thoughts carefully managed. In the industrial city of Merseburg, in the state of Saxony-Anhalt, that Tuesday morning feeling was a permanent condition. The chemical plants on the edge of town breathed a yellowish haze across the low skyline, and the apartment blocks along Karl-Marx-Strasse stood in their identical rows like sentries who had forgotten what they were guarding. Children grew up there learning early that the world had a shape, a fixed, total shape, and that the shape had been designed by history itself, by forces so large and so certain that questioning them was not merely dangerous but fundamentally absurd. Albrecht Dietrich was born into that world on August 25, 1949. The exact address was 11 Kirchstrasse in Merseburg, a city of roughly 60,000 people that had been grinding out chemicals, fertilizers, and industrial compounds since before the First World War. His father, Horst Dietrich, was a disciplined, exacting man, a schoolteacher in the state system, and his mother, Gertrude, kept the household running with the efficient practicality that life in post-war Germany demanded. The family was not wealthy, but they were not hungry. They were, by the standards of the German Democratic Republic, stable, respectable, exactly the kind of family the state preferred to produce. Two things defined Albrecht's earliest years. The first was the ruins. Merseburg had been bombed heavily during the war, and while much of it had been rebuilt or cleared away by the time Albrecht was old enough to walk its streets, the scars were everywhere in the gaps between buildings where something had once stood. In the careful way adults changed the subject when the war came up in conversation, in the slightly haunted quality that clung to older faces like a scent that would not wash out. The second was the wall. Not the physical wall itself, which went up in Berlin in August of 1961, when Albrecht was 11 years old, but the psychological architecture it represented, the understanding, felt before it was ever articulated, that the world on the other side of the border was a fundamentally different place, and that the distance between here and there was measured not in kilometers but in ideology. The East Germany that Albrecht grew up in was a state built on a specific and unyielding idea. That the Soviet Union had liberated Germany from fascism, that the capitalist West was infected with the same disease that had produced Adolf Hitler, and that the German Democratic Republic represented something genuinely new and morally correct in the world. The Sozialistische Einheitspartei Deutschlands, the Socialist Unity Party, ran everything. The schools, the newspapers, the youth organizations, the courts. There was no corner of public life that existed outside its gaze, and there was no institution more thoroughly committed to installing the ideology into young minds than the Freie Deutsche Jugend, the Free German Youth Movement, known universally by its initials, the FDJ. Albrecht joined the FDJ, as virtually every East German teenager did. It was not presented as optional. The blue shirts, the meetings, the slogans, the carefully structured sense of collective purpose, all of it surrounded him the way weather surrounds a town. He absorbed the ideology the way any intelligent child absorbs the environment he is placed in, which is to say completely, naturally, and without distinguishing it from reality. The Soviet Union was the guarantor of peace. America was the aggressor, the imperialist power that had dropped atomic bombs on civilians and now pointed nuclear warheads at the workers of the world. West Germany was a puppet state, run by old Nazis in new suits. These were not opinions. They were facts, delivered in the same measured voice as arithmetic tables and conjugation rules. What distinguished Albrecht from many of his classmates was not his acceptance of the ideology that was routine but his intellectual capacity to engage with it. He was a gifted student, genuinely, measurably gifted, particularly in mathematics and the physical sciences. His teachers noted early that he possessed an unusual ability to hold complex systems in his mind simultaneously, to perceive the relationships between moving parts, to solve problems that required both rigor and creativity. These were qualities the East German state valued highly, particularly in children who came from the right kind of family with the right kind of attitude. Albrecht Dietrich was exactly the sort of young man the German Democratic Republic liked to cultivate. His childhood, for all its ideological weight, contained the textures of ordinary life. He played football in the streets with the other boys from his block, the games loud and argumentative in the way that boys' games always are, settling into the long summer evenings with the natural authority of ritual. He developed an early passion for chess, which his father had taught him when he was 6, sitting across from each other at the small kitchen table while the radio played classical music in the background. Chess appealed to something fundamental in Albrecht's temperament, the way every piece had a defined role, the way the board created a universe of perfect rules, the way victory came not through luck but through the capacity to think further ahead than your opponent. He became very good at it, good enough that he won regional tournaments as a teenager and good enough that the mental discipline it required shaped the way he approached every other challenge in his life. School came easily. He was the kind of student who did not need to study hard to achieve the highest marks, which in East Germany meant that the full machinery of state educational investment was pointed in his direction. When he was 16, a teacher pulled him aside after class and told him, with that particular gravity that educators in the GDR used to signal that something important was being communicated, that he had been recommended for advanced study. His aptitude scores were exceptional. His political attitude was sound. The state had taken note of him, and in East Germany, the state taking note of you was the beginning of everything. By the time he reached the end of his secondary education, the world had continued to shift and shake with the velocity that characterized the 1960s. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 had brought the world to the edge of annihilation and pulled it back. John F. Kennedy had been shot dead in Dallas in November of 1963, an event that East German state media covered with a measured satisfaction that it carefully packaged as objective reporting. The Vietnam War was consuming American credibility abroad while tearing the country apart at home. In West Germany, students were taking to the streets in protest. In East Germany, students were being carefully reminded that protest was what happened in places without a functioning socialist state, and that the correct response to bourgeois chaos was continued commitment to the collective project. Albrecht Dietrich graduated from secondary school in 1967 with marks that placed him at the very top of his cohort. He was accepted to study chemistry at the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena, one of the most prestigious academic institutions in the German Democratic Republic. His father drove him to the train station on the morning he left, carrying a single suitcase and a satchel of textbooks, and the two men shook hands at the platform in the way German fathers and sons of that generation did, firmly, without excessive sentiment, but with a weight behind it that said everything the spoken words left out. The train pulled away, and Albrecht watched Merseburg disappear behind him, the chemical plants and the apartment blocks and the gray, reliable sky shrinking away until they were gone. He was 18 years old, sharp as a scalpel, and utterly certain about the world. He had no idea, could not have imagined, on that train platform on that ordinary morning that within a few years, men he had never met, in offices he had never seen, in a city more than 1,000 kilometers away, had already begun to think carefully about what he might become. He did not know yet that the same qualities that made him an exceptional chemistry student, the discipline, the patience, the ability to hold competing realities in his mind without losing track of either, were precisely the qualities that a very different kind of organization was looking for. He did not know that Jena was the first step not just toward a chemistry degree, but toward a life so far outside the boundaries of anything he had yet imagined that the boy on the train and the man he would eventually become would barely seem to be the same person. But that was still ahead of him. For now, there was only the rhythm of the rails, the countryside of Saxony-Anhalt sliding past the window in shades of green and brown, and the particular clean feeling of a very intelligent young man heading toward a future that seemed, in every measurable way, to belong entirely to him. A gifted East German chemist, recruited in secret, handed a dead man's identity, and dropped into New York City with instructions to disappear into America and never come back. The KGB built him into someone else so completely that even the people closest to him never suspected a thing until the life they gave him became more real to him than the one he was born into. If that is the kind of story that stops you mid-scroll, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. What this man did next and what eventually happened to him is unlike anything else in the history of Cold War espionage. The Friedrich Schiller University sat in the center of Jena like a small, self-contained world, a world of lecture halls and laboratory corridors, of chalk-dusted blackboards and the particular hush of library reading rooms where the only sound was the scratch of pencils and the soft percussion of pages turning. The city itself was small by East German standards, a university town pressed between the slopes of the Saale Valley, its streets rising and falling in a way that made even short walks feel like mild exertions. In the winter, the cold came in hard from the east, and students moved between buildings with their collars up and their faces down, navigating the frost-edged pavements with the practiced urgency of people for whom warmth was always a destination and never a given. Albrecht Dietrich arrived in Jena in the autumn of 1967 and was immediately absorbed by the chemistry department, which had a reputation, within the East German academic system, for producing graduates of exceptional technical competence. The curriculum was rigorous and unforgiving, structured around the Soviet model of scientific education, which emphasized mathematical foundations, experimental discipline, and a strong theoretical understanding of industrial applications. Students were expected to master organic chemistry, physical chemistry, and analytical chemistry in parallel, carrying heavy course loads that left little room for the kind of intellectual wandering that characterized university life in the West. You came to the Friedrich Schiller University to work, and Albrecht worked. He was a natural fit for the environment. The precision that chemistry demanded, the exact measurement, the careful documentation, the patient repetition of experiments until the results were unambiguous matched something deep in his temperament. Where some of his classmates found the laboratory tedious, spending long hours with Bunsen burners and glassware and the acrid smell of reactions gone slightly wrong, Albrecht found it clarifying. The laboratory was a place where the world revealed itself honestly. You followed the procedure correctly and you got the result. You deviated, made assumptions, got careless, and the world told you so without hesitation. He respected that about it. He was also, from early in his first year, one of the best students in his cohort. Not in the obtrusive way of someone who needed recognition, but in the quiet way of someone who simply consistently outperformed the expectations set for him. His professors noticed. A few of them began assigning him additional problems, more complex variations on standard assignments, as a way of keeping him engaged and, perhaps, of measuring exactly how far his abilities extended. The results were consistently impressive. Albrecht Dietrich was the kind of student that good professors remembered years later, not because he was difficult or demanding, but because he was so clearly operating at a different level than the material he was being given. Outside the laboratory and the lecture hall, however, university life in East Germany carried its own particular character. The GDR ran its universities with the same thoroughness it applied to everything else. Student organizations were either extensions of the state apparatus or they did not exist. The FDJ had a strong presence on campus and active membership was expected, both as a matter of collective obligation and as a matter of practical self-interest, since students who demonstrated the wrong kind of political attitude found their academic paths mysteriously difficult. Albrecht had been a member through secondary school, and he continued his involvement at Jena not out of cynical calculation, but out of genuine conviction. The ideology was real to him. It had been built into him over 18 years with the patient thoroughness of a well-engineered structure, and it held. What the university did add to his political world was a sharpened analytical edge. Jena in the late 1960s was not immune to the turbulence crashing through universities elsewhere in the world. In 1968, French students threw cobblestones in Paris, and American students occupied buildings from Columbia to Berkeley. In Prague, Alexander Dubček's reformist government proposed a socialism with a human face, and Soviet tanks rolled in to answer the question of whether such a thing was permitted. At the Friedrich Schiller University, these events were discussed cautiously, within limits in political seminars that were officially part of the curriculum and unofficially a form of managed pressure release. Students could express concerns, voice questions, register intellectual discomfort, as long as the conversation arrived at the correct conclusions. Albrecht took these discussions seriously. He read voraciously the approved texts, but also whatever he could find from beyond the East German approved list, which was not much but was not nothing either. He thought carefully about the contradictions that kept surfacing, The gap between what the state said and what people privately observed, the distance between the promised future and the experienced present. He was intelligent enough to see the contradictions but ideologically committed enough to believe, for the time being, that they were problems of implementation rather than problems of the system itself. The idea that socialism was correct but the execution was imperfect was a position many educated East Germans held, and it was possible to hold it honestly, without surrendering either intelligence or integrity. It was during his third year at Jena that the first contact came. By that point, Albrecht was 20 years old. He was well established in the chemistry department, known to his professors as someone of unusual promise. His political record was clean and consistently reliable, exactly the kind of record that registered in the databases maintained not just by the University FDJ office, but by the Ministerium FA 1/4 Staatssicherheit, the Ministry for State Security. Everyone in East Germany knew the Stasi existed. Not everyone knew how comprehensively it watched. The Stasi maintained files on an estimated 1 in 3 East German citizens, ran a network of informal informants that penetrated every layer of society, and had a particular interest in university campuses, where the combination of young intelligence and political idealism made for a population worth monitoring very carefully. The initial contact was not dramatic. This was not a scene from a spy film, with a stranger sliding into the seat next to him at a CAFA copyright and pushing a sealed envelope across the table. What happened was considerably more ordinary, and considerably more effective for its ordinariness. A professor he respected, a man he had spoken with frequently after lectures, whose opinion he valued, invited him for coffee one afternoon and, in the course of a conversation that seemed at first like routine academic mentorship, asked him a question. The question was simple. Had Albrecht ever considered doing something more directly in service of the socialist state, beyond his academic work? Something with real impact at a high level? Albrecht had heard these kinds of conversations described. He knew, in the abstract way that everyone knew things in East Germany, that certain paths were available to certain kinds of people. He asked carefully what kind of service was being discussed. The professor smiled. He did not say the name of any organization. He said only that people who had Albrecht's qualities, his intelligence, his composure, his political reliability, his linguistic aptitude, were sometimes asked to apply those qualities in ways that went beyond the usual career trajectories. He said that if Albrecht was interested in knowing more, there were people he could speak with. He gave him a name and a telephone number on a plain piece of paper. Albrecht took the paper home. He sat with it for 3 days, turning the question over with the same methodical patience he brought to difficult chemistry problems. He was 20 years old, and the most consequential decision of his life was sitting on the desk beside his chemistry textbooks, masquerading as a phone number on a plain piece of paper. He understood by that 3rd day that the conversation with the professor had not been casual. He had been assessed. He had been evaluated over months or years without knowing it, his file reviewed by people he had never met, and the meeting had been the conclusion of a process, not the beginning of one. On the 4th day, he made the call. The voice on the other end was professional, unhurried. A meeting was arranged, no details over the phone, no specifics of any kind. Just a time and a location. A particular reading room in a building on the edge of campus. At 4 in the afternoon on a Thursday. Albrecht arrived 2 minutes early. He would always, from that point forward, arrive 2 minutes early. The man waiting for him inside was not what he expected, though he would have been hard-pressed to say exactly what he had expected. The man was ordinary-looking in the specific way that certain very capable people are ordinary-looking, medium height, medium build, the kind of face that would be difficult to describe accurately from memory 10 minutes after leaving the room. He introduced himself by a first name only, invited Albrecht to sit, and then did something that no one had ever done before in quite this way. He told Albrecht Dietrich, precisely and without embellishment, that the Komitet Gospodarstvenной Bezopasnosti, the Committee for State Security of the Soviet Union, had been watching him, and that they believed he had the qualities to serve the socialist cause at the highest possible level. The room held that statement for a long moment after it was spoken. Albrecht noticed, with the clinical part of his mind that never quite stopped observing, that his hands were perfectly still on the table. The man across the table did not hurry the silence. He let it sit between them the way experienced people let silence sit, not as a void to be filled, but as a space in which the other person could come to terms with what had just been said. Albrecht Dietrich did not fill the silence either. He sat with his hands still on the table and looked at the man whose face he would not be able to describe accurately 10 minutes from now, and he understood that the room had just divided his life, cleanly and permanently, into before and after. When he finally spoke, he asked a question that was, in retrospect, entirely characteristic of him. He did not ask why him. He did not ask whether this was dangerous. He did not ask for reassurance about the ideology or the mission or the risks. He asked, what exactly would be required? The man across the table, Albrecht, would learn later that he was an officer of the KGB's intelligence directorate, operating out of the Soviet embassy's security apparatus and liaising with the East German counterpart services, seemed to appreciate the precision of the question. He answered it with equal precision. What would be required was everything. Not in the sense of danger, though danger was a real possibility and would be discussed honestly. In the sense of commitment. What the KGB looked for in the kind of agent they were proposing to recruit was not bravery in the conventional sense, not the bravery of the battlefield, but the rarer and more sustainable quality of absolute, sustained discipline. The ability to live a second life constructed, maintained, performed without ever allowing the boundary between the performance and the performer to become blurred. He said that the KGB was building something specific. A program of deep cover agents, illegals in the intelligence terminology, meaning operatives who carried no diplomatic credentials and no official cover, who lived inside the target country as ordinary citizens with no institutional connection to the Soviet state whatsoever. Not embassy attaché copyright-s. Not trade representatives. Ordinary people. People with jobs and apartments and neighbors and morning routines. People who paid their electricity bills and complained about the weather and whose true nature was known to no one in their immediate environment. People who were, in every observable respect, exactly what they appeared to be and who were, beneath that appearance, something entirely different. This was the Directorate S program, though he did not use that name. The illegals, illegal in German, nelegalny in Russian, were considered by the KGB to be the most valuable and most difficult to produce of all intelligence assets. A diplomat caught spying was expelled. A local informant arrested was a local problem. An illegal who was caught was a catastrophe, because the illegal represented a massive and irreplaceable investment of time, resources, and risk. But the illegal who was not caught, who operated undetected for years inside prime target territory, had access to information and networks that no embassy-based officer could come close to matching. The illegal went where they were told, lived where they needed to live, became whoever they needed to become. The target territory the man described was the United States of America. Albrecht let that land. He was 20 years old, sitting in a reading room in Jena, and the man across the table was telling him that the KGB wanted to send him to America. Not for a few months. Not on a temporary assignment. Permanently, or as close to permanently as the mission required. He would go to America and become an American. He would build a life there so complete and so convincing that no one, not his neighbors, not his colleagues, not his acquaintances, would ever have reason to suspect that the man they knew was anything other than who he appeared to be. He would grow roots. He would establish himself. And from that position of stability and access, he would serve the Soviet state. The man asked if he had questions. Albrecht had many questions, and he asked them methodically, working through them the way he worked through a complex problem in analytical chemistry, identifying the key variables, testing the assumptions, looking for the places where the logic held and the places where it required further examination. He asked about training, about the process of constructing a new identity, about communications with Moscow, about what happened if something went wrong, about what happened to the original Albrecht Dietrich, his family, his documented existence, his life in East Germany. The man answered each question directly and without condescension, which Albrecht noted and appreciated. The meeting lasted a little over 2 hours. At the end of it, the man told him he did not need to decide immediately. He was encouraged to take a week to think carefully to make the decision that felt right. But he also said, with the measured candor that seemed to be his natural register, that this kind of offer was made rarely and to very few people, and that the KGB's confidence in Albrecht Dietrich was the product of extensive evaluation over a long period. He was not being asked to take a risk on faith. He was being asked to commit to a cause he already believed in, using capabilities he already possessed, in service of objectives he already considered important. Albrecht went home and thought about it. He thought about it with extraordinary honesty, in the way that he would later describe as one of the most fully realized moments of intellectual engagement of his life, a genuine reckoning with what was being proposed and what it would mean. He thought about his parents, and the specific weight of what it would mean to leave them without being able to explain why or for how long. He thought about chemistry, and whether he was genuinely prepared to abandon what had become a genuinely absorbing discipline. He thought about the ideology, testing it against the proposition the way you test a hypothesis against evidence. What he found, when he was honest with himself, was that the ideology held. He believed, and at 20 years old, this belief was sincere, grounded in everything his life had taught him about the world, that the socialist project was the correct answer to the problems of the 20th century. He believed that America represented the organized defense of capital against the human interest, and that the Soviet Union, despite its imperfections, despite the gap he could see clearly between the theory and the practice, represented a genuinely different and genuinely better possibility for humanity. The Cold War was not, to his mind, a conflict between two imperfect powers. It was a conflict between two fundamentally different ideas about what the world should be, and he had no doubt which side of that conflict deserved to win. The adventure of it was also real, and he was honest enough to admit that to himself. There was something in him, the chess player's mind, the chemistry student's appetite for complexity, that responded to the sheer scale of what was being proposed. Not careless excitement, not the blunt enthusiasm of someone who has not thought carefully about risk, but a deep, considered engagement with the idea that his life could contain something so consequential, so hidden, so far beyond the boundaries of anything his father or grandfather had ever imagined possible. On the 6th day, he called the number again and said that he would do it. What followed moved quickly but not recklessly. He was told to complete his chemistry degree without alteration, without any change in his behavior or his academic performance that might be noticed. He was to say nothing to anyone, not his parents, not his closest friends, not anyone. The cover story, when the time came, would be constructed for him, but the discipline of silence had to begin immediately, because discipline of silence was not a skill you could acquire on demand. It had to be practiced, lived with, made habitual. He graduated from the Friedrich Schiller University in 1970 with a degree in chemistry and marks that would have opened doors to research positions, industrial roles, academic careers. None of those doors were going to be used. Instead, a few weeks after graduation, he was given travel documents, the paperwork smooth and thoroughly official in the way that only things produced by the state machinery of a communist government could be, and told to present himself at a specific address in East Berlin. He packed a single bag. He left his apartment with the furniture still in it. He told his parents he had been offered a position in a state research program, and that the nature of the work meant he would not be able to be in regular contact. His mother's face did something complicated in the moment after he said this, a flash of something not quite fear, not quite understanding, something that lived in the territory between them that he chose not to examine too carefully, because he had made his decision and examining it too carefully would not serve either of them. The train to Berlin left at 7:30 in the morning. He was 21 years old, and the world that was waiting for him on the other side of the journey was, in every meaningful sense, entirely different from the world he was leaving. He understood this as he watched the Jena skyline recede in the train window, the university buildings and the valley slopes and the gray-blue sky above all of it sliding away from him as if the landscape itself were quietly withdrawing. He did not look away until there was nothing left to see. Moscow in the early 1970s was a city that presented two faces simultaneously, and the art of living in it was knowing which face was which. The broad ceremonial avenues, the monumental buildings, the ordered public spaces with their carefully maintained gardens and their bronze statues of men who had made history in the ways the state approved of. All of this formed the official face, the face that appeared in Pravda photographs and foreign visitor brochures. Behind it, pressing through the gaps, was the other city. The gray apartment blocks of Khrushchev's housing program stretching to the horizon in every direction, the bread queues that formed regardless of the season, the particular resourcefulness that Muscovites had developed for navigating a system that provided much in theory and considerably less in practice. Albrecht Dietrich arrived in Moscow in the late spring of 1971 and saw both faces at once, because that is what happened when you arrived with your eyes open and your analytical mind running. He was taken to a safe house in the northwestern part of the city, a small apartment in an unremarkable building on an unremarkable street, and told that this would be his home for the foreseeable future. His contact in East Berlin had handed him off to a KGB officer he knew only by a working name, Mikhail, who was responsible for coordinating his training. Mikhail was a man of perhaps 50, methodical and economical in everything he did. His movements, his speech, his use of time. He did not waste words. He did not perform authority. He simply had it, in the way that people do when their authority rests on genuine competence rather than rank insignia. The first thing Mikhail told him was that the training program he was entering typically ran for several years. Not months. Years. He said this without any particular emphasis, as if 5 years were a reasonable and expected measure of time to invest in a single objective, which, given the objective, it was. He said that the training would cover a range of areas, and that the sequence and pace would be adjusted to Albrecht's demonstrated progress. Some areas would come easily. Others would not. He said that the most common reason capable agents failed to complete the program was not lack of intelligence or lack of commitment, but loss of patience, the difficulty of sustaining, over years, the particular mental discipline of living in preparation for a future that remained entirely abstract. Language came first. Albrecht already had a working knowledge of English from his school years in East Germany, which was not nothing, but which was a long way from what would be required. East German English education was solid on grammar and vocabulary and almost entirely useless for anything resembling natural fluency. It produced people who could read technical texts and compose formally correct sentences, but who spoke with the stilted precision of someone translating in real time, every word passing through a filter before being produced. What he needed was English that bypassed the filter, entirely English that lived in the body the way German lived in his body, automatic and instinctive and full of the thousand small habits that native speakers carry without being aware of them. The KGB's approach to language training in this period was intensive and immersive in ways that the East German school system could not begin to approximate. He worked with language tutors who were either native English speakers or fluent to an indistinguishable degree, spending hours each day in conversation that was monitored, corrected, analyzed, and repeated. He was required to read American newspapers and magazines, the New York Times, Newsweek, Sports Illustrated, Reader's Digest, to absorb not just vocabulary but register, the way different contexts demanded different language. He listened to recordings of American radio broadcasts, American advertising, American sports commentary, American news reportage. By the time that first phase of language work was well advanced, he had internalized not just the words but the music of American English, the rhythms and cadences, and the particular aggressive friendliness of American casual speech that was so different from the measured formality of German social interaction. American culture was an equally demanding subject. The KGB understood something that is often underestimated, that language fluency without cultural fluency is a liability. You can say the words correctly and still reveal yourself through your reactions, through the things you find funny or not funny, through the cultural references you miss or the ones you reach for incorrectly, through the small social rituals that Americans perform automatically because they have absorbed them since childhood and that a foreigner must laboriously learn and consciously execute. His tutors worked through American history, not the broad survey but the lived detail, the presidents, the wars, the sports teams, the music, the films, the television programs, the advertising campaigns, the regional differences between the East Coast and the Midwest and the South, the class distinctions that Americans refused to acknowledge even as they enforced them scrupulously. He studied American geography at a granular level, memorizing not just the major cities but the fabric of urban American life, the names of department stores and supermarket chains, the layout of a typical American diner, the etiquette of American banks and post offices and bureaucratic interactions, the way Americans address strangers and acquaintances and employers. He was taught American idiom, not the dictionary definitions, but the living usage, with all its context and connotation. He was taught American slang at various periods and for various demographics, and taught to recognize which register was appropriate for which situation. He was taught how Americans argued, how they paid compliments, how they complained, how they told jokes, and crucially what they found funny, because humor is the most culturally specific of all human activities and the hardest to fake convincingly. Tradecraft, in the strict intelligence sense of the word, was taught in parallel with the cultural preparation, and it was here that Albrecht found the most intellectually absorbing material. The KGB's tradecraft curriculum for Directorate S illegals in this period was extraordinarily comprehensive, drawing on decades of accumulated experience and refined through the operational lessons of previous cases, including cases that had gone wrong in instructive ways. He learned surveillance and counter-surveillance, how to identify whether you were being followed, how to lose a tail if you were, how to behave in a way that created no reason for anyone to start following you in the first place. He learned the theory and practice of dead drops, the physical mechanisms for exchanging information and materials without direct contact between parties, the selection criteria for sites, the signal protocols that confirmed a drop was active or compromised. He learned brush passes, the technique by which two people exchange a small package in a brief physical near contact so natural in appearance that a casual observer would register nothing. He learned photography for intelligence purposes, not just how to operate equipment but how to photograph documents with the speed and consistency required in the field, where you might have minutes or seconds with sensitive material and no opportunity to reshoot. He studied invisible inks, microdots, encryption techniques, one-time pads, and the use of shortwave radio for receiving encoded messages from Moscow. He was taught the security principle that would govern his entire operational life. Compartmentalization, the discipline of knowing only what you needed to know and revealing only what you needed to reveal, to no one except those whose need to know was absolute. Alongside the operational training ran a physical conditioning regimen, not intensive enough to produce the conspicuous physique of an athlete that would have been counterproductive, since the goal was to look unremarkable but rigorous enough to build the stamina, the composure under pressure, and the physical self-control that sustained undercover work required. He was taught hand-to-hand techniques designed for avoidance and escape rather than confrontation. He was taught to drive in American traffic conditions, practicing on a course designed to simulate the particular character of American urban driving, which differed from European driving in ways subtle enough to be noticeable. And through all of this, across months that stretched into years, he was being evaluated. The training was not merely an education. It was a continuous assessment conducted by people whose professional obligation was to identify weakness before it could manifest in the field. Every aspect of his performance was observed and analyzed. His stress responses, his decision-making under uncertainty, his ability to maintain composure in situations designed to test exactly that. He was placed in mock interrogations, realistic, uncomfortable, extended, and observed for his ability to sustain a cover story under pressure, to avoid the small inconsistencies that accumulate when a person is lying and does not have a deep enough mastery of the lie to make it automatic. He was placed in social situations with other people involved in the program, people who were simultaneously being tested themselves and testing him, and the quality of his performance in those situations was as carefully assessed as anything that happened in a formal training setting. There was a woman he knew slightly during that period, not a fellow trainee but a language instructor, a Russian woman in her mid-30s who had spent several years in the United States and brought a kind of lived American authenticity to her sessions that was different from the bookish precision of the other tutors. She told him once, during a break between lessons, that the hardest part of what he was preparing to do was not the lying. Most intelligent people could learn to lie well enough for most purposes. The hardest part was what she called the loneliness of certainty, the experience of knowing something about your own life, something fundamental and defining, that you could share with absolutely no one. Not a friend, not a lover, not a parent, no one. He filed that observation away the way he filed everything. Precisely, completely, without sentimentality. He understood that it was important. He would understand how important rather later, and in much more personal terms, than he could have imagined on the day she said it. The training ran from 1971 to approximately 1976, though the exact timeline shifted as operational planning evolved. During those years, Albrecht Dietrich stayed in Moscow, moved between safe houses, and ceased in any practical sense to exist. His life in East Germany was a closed chapter. His parents believed he was working in a classified research role. His former classmates had moved on to careers, marriages, and the accumulating ordinariness of adult life. The world that had produced him was continuing without him, indifferent to his absence, as worlds do. In Moscow, meanwhile, a new person was being built. Not born built, constructed with the care and precision of a fine instrument, piece by piece, year by year, until the construction was complete and the instrument was ready to be used. That person did not yet have a name, but Moscow was already working on one. In the records held by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, in the files of births and deaths that the state had been maintaining since the middle of the 19th century, there exists a notice of death registered in 1955. The child's name was Jack Joseph Barsky. He had been born on November 6, 1952, in the city of Philadelphia, to parents who had given him a solidly American name at a time when solidly American names were both an aesthetic preference and, in some families, a quiet declaration of assimilation. Jack Joseph Barsky was 2 years old when he died. The exact cause was listed in the record, a brief and clinical notation on a form that was filed, organized, and placed in an archive where it joined the thousands of other small tragedies that any large state's vital statistics office accumulates in any given year. The child's parents grieved. They buried their son. They continued their lives, as people must, carrying the loss the way bereaved parents always carry the loss of a very young child, not diminishing with time exactly, but shifting into a different part of the self, becoming a weight that is always there but no longer prevents movement. By the 1970s, Jack Joseph Barsky had been gone for 20 years. His grave, in whatever cemetery his parents had chosen, marked the span of a life that had lasted 2 years and left no records beyond those that bureaucratic systems automatically generate: a birth certificate, a death certificate, and whatever brief notice appeared in the local newspaper that his family had arranged. He had never attended school, so there were no school records. He had never held a job, so there were no employment records. He had never applied for a driver's license or a passport or a social security card. The child who had been Jack Joseph Barsky had lived and died before any of those systems had any occasion to register his existence beyond the initial birth record. And this, the complete absence of a documented adult life, was precisely what made his name so valuable to the KGB. The principle that the KGB was exploiting is sometimes called the tombstone legend, a term that is both descriptive and, given how it worked, appropriately grim. American children who died in infancy in the mid-20th century existed in public records in a peculiar state of administrative incompleteness. Their births were documented. Their deaths were documented. But because they died before the systems of adult life could reach them, there was an open space in the record where a person ought to have grown up, an empty stretch of documented years that the bureaucratic record did not contradict because, from the bureaucracy's perspective, simply had not happened yet. All you needed, in theory, was the birth certificate. With a birth certificate in hand, you could apply for a Social Security card because the Social Security Administration had no direct link in this era to state death record databases. With a Social Security card, you could build further. A driver's license if you managed the supporting documentation carefully. Passport, eventually. The security vulnerabilities this created were exploited by multiple intelligence services during the Cold War, but the Soviets were particularly systematic about it. KGB officers ran research operations targeting American vital records, in some cases operating through local contacts, in other cases exploiting the relative accessibility of county and municipal record systems in the pre-digital era, when records were physical documents held in physical offices and a determined researcher with a plausible cover story could request access to public files without triggering the kind of electronic audit trails that modern record systems generate automatically. The process of finding a suitable name, one with the right birth year, the right state of origin, the right absence of surviving adult documentation, was methodical and detailed, and it took time. For Albrecht Dietrich's assignment, the KGB needed a legend that placed a credible American male somewhere in the range of 1949 to 1952, born in a major American city, with documentation that would survive the scrutiny of the identity verification systems he would encounter in everyday American civilian life. The name they selected, Jack Joseph Barsky, born in Philadelphia in November 1952, dead in 1955, was close enough in age to Albrecht's own birth year of 1949 to be workable, though the 2-year discrepancy required careful management whenever his age came up in practical contexts. When Mikhail presented the name to Albrecht sometime in the mid-1970s, the transaction carried a weight that was distinct from the purely operational. Mikhail explained whose name it had been with the matter-of-fact brevity that characterized all of his communications, but he was thorough about it. Here is the birth record, here is the death record, here is the gap, here is how the documentation chain is constructed from this point forward. Albrecht sat with this information and did something with it that was characteristic of the kind of person he had become through years of training. He noted it, organized it, and accepted it as an operational fact. But he also, in the privacy of his own mind, registered its human dimension. A real child had existed. A real family had suffered. The name that the KGB was proposing to take and use as a cover was not simply a bureaucratic construction, it was the name on a grave. He did not dwell on this. Dwelling on the moral texture of his situation was precisely the kind of cognitive activity that his training had taught him to recognize and manage, because unmanaged, it led exactly where operational security could not afford to go. But he noticed it. He filed it in the category of things that existed, that were real, that formed part of the context of what he was doing, even if they could not be permitted to alter the course of it. The documentation construction that followed was meticulous. The birth certificate was the foundation, and its acquisition through a research process that Albrecht was not directly involved in, carried out by KGB support staff, came first. From that document, a social security card was obtained through the application process, which at that time could be completed by mail with documentary support, without the kind of personal verification that later became standard. The Social Security number was real, that is, it was a genuine number issued by the United States Social Security Administration because it had been applied for through the actual application process, not manufactured. This was important because a fabricated number would fail any check against official records, while a legitimately issued number, even one obtained fraudulently, would pass. The training adapted to incorporate the legend. He was no longer merely Albrecht Dietrich practicing to become an American. He was now, in an administrative sense, in training to become a specific American. The biography was constructed with the careful attention to internal consistency that a good novelist brings to a character's backstory, except that the consequences of an inconsistency here were considerably more serious than a negative review. Jack Barsky had grown up in Pennsylvania. He had attended schools whose records might or might not exist in forms accessible to a determined investigator. He had a family history that was vague in ways that could be naturally explained by the disruptions common to American working-class biography moves, family complications, the ordinary turbulence of a life that did not lend itself to tidy documentation. Every element was tested. Mikhail ran him through extended question-and-answer sessions about his legend, coming at it from unexpected angles, looking for the seams, the places where the story faltered or required a moment's thought where an instant's fluency should have appeared. Who was his mother's maiden name? What street did he grow up on? What elementary school had he attended? What team did he support? These questions were not there because anyone was expected to ask them in exactly this form in ordinary American life. Adults rarely need to recite the name of their third-grade teacher to a stranger, but because the point of the exercise was to make the legend as instinctive as native memory. You did not want to have to retrieve the information when it was needed. You wanted it to surface the way genuine memory surfaces, without effort, without the faint shadow of retrieval that a practiced liar has to work to conceal. He rehearsed the name until it became his name. Not a tag he wore over his real name, but a replacement. Albrecht Dietrich had to become not a secondary personality, but an archived one, something sealed and complete and set aside in a part of the self that had no practical daily relevance whatsoever. The man who would walk through the doors he was being prepared to walk through had to be Jack Barsky completely, in every fiber of his social self. The practice of becoming that person was, by this period of his training, no longer a drill. It was the daily reality. He tried, on occasion, to explain to himself what the experience of carrying two complete biographies simultaneously actually felt like. The best approximation he could find was musical, something like playing an instrument in a key that your hands were not trained for, until eventually, after enough practice, the new key became as natural as the old one. Except that you never entirely forget the old key. It persists in the muscles somewhere, dormant, available for retrieval but no longer the default. What Jack Barsky felt like in those late years of training in Moscow was a key his hands were almost ready to play in. The name, the biography, the social persona, the cultural reflexes, all of it was in place or nearly in place. The mechanism was ready. The only remaining question was when exactly the operation would begin. Moscow's answer, when it came, was 1978. Jack Barsky was going to America. The insertion did not begin in New York. It began in Austria, in Vienna, in the winter of 1978, at a point in the long, careful process of placing Jack Barsky inside the United States where the first steps had to be taken on European soil before any piece of American ground could be touched. This was standard procedure for the KGB's illegal program. The direct movement of an operative from Moscow to a target country without any intervening cover was too risky, too traceable, too dependent on a single documentary chain that had to be perfect from the very first step. The indirect route, a cover story that began in a third country and evolved naturally toward the target, provided layers of separation that made the overall legend more credible and the operational trail more difficult to reconstruct. Vienna was chosen for reasons that were partly geographic and partly historical. Austria occupied a peculiar position in the Cold War architecture, a neutral country that sat at the edge of the Eastern Bloc and had developed, over the decades since 1955 when Soviet occupation forces withdrew and Austrian sovereignty was restored, a certain tacit reputation as a city where the intelligence services of both sides operated with a slightly greater degree of latitude than they enjoyed elsewhere. This was not the famous Berlin of spy films and checkpoint crossings. Vienna's atmosphere was richer, more civilized, more arranged, the espionage conducted in the lobbies of the Grand Hotel and over pastries in the conditoré rather than at gunpoint in the rain. But the operational logic it offered was genuine. The ability to establish a paper trail placing Jack Barsky in a legitimate Western European location before he contacted any American institution. He had made a brief exploratory insertion to the United States before this, in 1976, a preliminary trip that was more reconnaissance than operation, a short visit designed to test the documentation, observe American customs and immigration procedures at first hand, and allow him to calibrate the vast difference between studying America and actually moving through a specific American city as a specific American person. That trip had been short and carefully controlled, but it had given him something that no amount of classroom preparation could fully replicate. The kinetic reality of it, the sensory confirmation that the world he had been training for was precisely the world he had been training for. He had walked through a major American airport with his documents and his composed face and his American English, and the officials at the border had looked at his papers and looked at him and waved him through, and he had walked out into the American air and his training had held. In 1978, the real operation began. The route from Moscow to his eventual American residence took him westward through Eastern Europe, across into Austria, and from there to Canada, a transit point that served, like the Vienna stop, as an additional layer of cover for his movement toward the United States. Canada was chosen partly because the Canadian border crossing into the United States offered a somewhat different documentary environment than a direct transatlantic arrival at a major American international airport, and partly because the cover story constructed for Jack Barsky placed his re-entry into American life as a man returning to the country after a period spent abroad, without the need for a fully elaborated narrative about where exactly he had been. He crossed into the United States at the Canadian border, presenting his documentation with the calm that 7 years of training had made available to him as a permanent state of being. The border officer was routine in his inspection. The early 1978 period predated the systematic database checks that would later become standard, and the crossing was completed without incident. Jack Barsky, in every document that mattered, was an American citizen returning home. What New York looked like in those first weeks is worth lingering on, because the contrast with what he was leaving was not subtle. It was 1978, and New York City was in one of the most turbulent periods of its modern existence. The financial crisis of 1975 had left the city still struggling to recover. The infrastructure was visibly deteriorating. The subway cars covered in graffiti inside and out. The streets in many neighborhoods carrying the marks of disinvestment and neglect. The crime rate was elevated and rising. The South Bronx was burning, or at least seemed to be burning, with abandoned buildings torched for insurance money and fire department response times stretched to breaking point across vast swathes of the borough. Times Square was a concentrated exhibition of everything that late 70s urban decay could produce: peep shows, pawn shops, drug transactions conducted with the casual openness of a street market. This was not the America of the orientation films and the Reader's Digest articles and the careful pedagogical materials that had formed his American education in Moscow. Those materials had their own accurate dimensions. The supermarket abundance was real, the domestic technology was real, the sheer material prosperity of ordinary American life compared to its Soviet equivalent was genuine and striking. But they had not prepared him for the rawness of the city, the physical intensity of it, the noise and the smell and the crowding and the particular aggressive energy of New York in that period, which mixed ambition with desperation in a way that no other city quite managed to replicate. He found a room in a boarding house in Manhattan, a cheap, sparse arrangement in a neighborhood that asked few questions about its residents, which was exactly what he needed. The room was small enough that the single window looked out onto a brick wall at a distance of perhaps 6 feet, and the heat came through a radiator that clanked and hissed with the aggressive unreliability of old New York plumbing. The communal bathroom was on the floor below. The other residents were a selection of the city's transient population, people who were passing through, or who had been passing through for years, or who had arrived intending to pass through and found themselves, through the accumulation of small difficulties, still there. His immediate priorities were practical and pressing. The documentation chain he had brought with him gave him a social security number and a birth certificate. What he needed next was proof of a residential address for which the boarding house served temporarily and a work history, which was a significant and complicated problem. Jack Barsky had a social security number but no employment history attached to it. He could not simply walk into a professional job interview with a strong resume and a persuasive personality and expect the paperwork to hold up at the level of scrutiny that a real employer did real verification at. He needed to begin at the bottom in terms of both compensation and documentary requirements and work his way up, building a genuine employment record that would, in time, look exactly like what it purported to be. Ivan, his primary KGB contact in the United States, met through a protocol established before his departure from Europe. In a first brief meeting that followed the precise dead drop and recognition procedures he had rehearsed for years, gave him money to live on while he established himself. This was not unusual for the initial phase of an illegal operation. The KGB expected that building a credible resident legend would take time and would require initial financial support, and the cost of that support was a trivial line item against the overall investment the program represented. The first job he found was manual labor, the kind of work that asked for a strong back and minimal paperwork. He worked briefly in construction, then in a warehouse operation on the far west side. The work was hard in ways that his academic and training years had not prepared his body for. Not impossibly hard, but the daily physical depletion of it was a new experience, and it taught him things about the texture of ordinary American working life that no amount of reading had conveyed. He learned the social dynamics of the lunch break, the codes of respect and disrespect that operated in blue-collar workplaces, the way American men of limited education talked about their families and their bosses and their plans. He absorbed it the way he absorbed everything, wholly, quietly, without drawing attention to the fact that he was absorbing it at all. Other things about New York surprised him with their vividness. The food, first of all, the sheer variety of it, the accessibility of it, the experience of walking through a neighborhood at any hour and finding diners and takeout counters open and offering things he had no word for in German and only recently acquired words for in English. The bookshops and the newsstands, with their overwhelming displays of publications that ranged from the sophisticated to the lurid, all of it available to anyone with the money to purchase it. The music that came from open windows and passing car radios and the buskers in the subway entrances. The city in 1978 was at a peculiar creative crossroads, disco and punk and the earliest stirrings of hip-hop all occupying the same urban space at the same moment, and the auditory experience of walking through it was something that no Soviet-era description of American cultural life had come close to capturing. He was careful precisely, deliberately, professionally careful not to let any of this show on the surface. He was Jack Barsky, a man who had been away from the country for some time and was reacquainting himself with it through the ordinary mechanisms of getting established in a new city. He was friendly in the measured way that the training had taught him was appropriate, warm enough not to seem suspicious, distant enough not to invite the kind of sustained personal attention that produced questions he could not answer. He listened more than he talked. He established habits and routines because habits and routines were what normal residents developed, and abnormality was the enemy. But in the private space of his boarding house room at night, sitting in the orange light of the single lamp on the desk, he allowed himself to register the scale of what he was in the middle of. He was 28 years old, alone in the largest city in the United States, without a single person in his immediate environment who knew who he actually was. The city outside the window made its perpetual noise, the traffic and the sirens and the arguments from the floor below and the distant percussion of a radio somewhere in the building, and he sat in it and understood, in the most concrete possible terms, what the language instructor in Moscow had meant when she talked about the loneliness of certainty. He knew something that no one around him knew. He would always know it. And the weight of that knowledge, while entirely manageable, he was trained for it, he had prepared for it, was real. It was a weight you carried in specific places in the body, and no amount of professional discipline entirely eliminated it. He turned off the lamp. Outside, New York continued without him. Tomorrow he would get up early and go back to the warehouse, and the day after that, and the day after that, until the life of Jack Barsky had enough substance to support the next phase of the operation. He had arrived. Now he had to stay. Building a life from manufactured materials requires a different kind of patience from building one from genuine experience. In ordinary life, a person accumulates the infrastructure of their existence gradually, over years, through a combination of effort and circumstance and the particular accidents that steer every biography in directions that could not have been predicted from the starting point. Documents are acquired one at a time, as each situation requires them. Employment histories grow one job at a time. Social connections form and dissolve and form again through the natural process of proximity and shared experience. The accumulation is organic, messy, full of gaps and overlaps and inconsistencies that real life routinely generates and that real bureaucratic systems routinely absorb without alarm, because real bureaucratic systems process millions of people and are designed to accommodate the normal imperfections of human documentation. An intelligence legend had to do something bureaucratic systems could not do naturally. Produce that same organic-seeming accumulation deliberately, systematically, and without any of the genuine messy experience that would have generated it. Jack Barsky could not actually have attended middle school in Pennsylvania. He could not actually have held a series of jobs through his 20s. He could not actually have accumulated a credit history or a driving record or a bank account through the years of his documented existence. All of these things had to be created retroactively, or to be approached in ways that skirted the need for them, while still producing a present-day picture of a person that looked, to any system that examined it, like someone who had always been there. The Social Security number was the cornerstone. With it, he could open a bank account, and he did a simple checking account at a mid-sized New York bank, depositing the initial cash from Moscow in amounts and at intervals carefully calibrated to avoid triggering the reporting thresholds that the Bank Secrecy Act of 1970 had established for financial institutions. The account existed, was real, drew interest, and provided him with the documentary basis for establishing credit. He applied in time for a credit card. The limit was modest, the purpose operational. Each month's statement was another piece of evidence that Jack Barsky was a functioning economic entity with a real transactional existence in the American financial system. A driver's license was an early priority both for practical mobility and because the license was among the most commonly requested forms of identification in American daily life. New York State issued driver's licenses through the Department of Motor Vehicles, and the documentation requirements at that time were less stringent than they would become in later decades. He presented his Social Security card, his birth certificate, and the boarding house address as his place of residence, passed the tests, driving came naturally, having been trained on American-style traffic patterns in Moscow and received his license. The photograph on it showed him exactly as he appeared in daily life. A man in his late 20s with dark hair, a composed expression, and nothing about him that would catch a second look. He moved from the boarding house into his own apartment as soon as the economy of his situation permitted it. The apartment was in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood that in 1978 was working class and ethnically mixed, the kind of neighborhood where nobody much cared about your background as long as you paid your rent on time and didn't make trouble. He paid his rent on time. He did not make trouble. He learned the names of his immediate neighbors, offered the appropriate amounts of small talk at appropriate moments, and maintained the distance that New York City neighborly relations generally permitted and even encouraged. New Yorkers, he had quickly understood, had a remarkable capacity for the performative indifference that allowed densely packed urban populations to coexist without constant friction. You could live in an apartment building for years and know almost nothing about the people on either side of you, and this was considered normal, even preferable. His career, if it could be called that in these early years, needed to evolve. The KGB had not sent him to America to unload trucks forever. He had a chemistry degree from a prestigious East German university. A working knowledge of programming languages that he had acquired as part of his training computing was becoming increasingly critical in both technical and business contexts, and Moscow had been insistent that operational agents needed this competency and a strategic intelligence mission that required him to be positioned somewhere where his access was valuable. The plan, broadly, was for him to move upward through the American corporate world to a position where he had access to the kind of technical and strategic information that Moscow's collection priorities demanded. The immediate challenge was that his East German chemistry degree could not be presented. His legend placed him in Pennsylvania, not in the German Democratic Republic, and explaining a German academic credential was an unfixable problem that the legend was designed to circumvent entirely. He decided to pursue a degree through the American system, using a path that several practical factors made available: night school and continuing education programs that catered to working adults who didn't have the luxury of full-time academic study. He enrolled in courses at a City University of New York institution, working toward a degree in computer science, a field that was both genuinely interesting to him and strategically relevant. The work was not difficult. His underlying mathematical and scientific training meant the material came to him more easily than it came to most of his classmates, and he performed well without making his performance conspicuous in the way that might prompt curiosity about where such competence came from. He also pursued English language immersion with renewed intensity, not because his English was deficient by this point, it was highly fluent, but because he understood that there were still registers he had not fully inhabited. Academic English was one thing. The English of government offices and bureaucratic forms was another. The English of job interviews and professional settings was another still. He read constantly, newspapers, magazines, technical publications, anything that expanded his vocabulary for the specific professional world he was building his way toward. He paid particular attention to the idioms that professional American English used, the jargon and the conventions that marked you as an insider in a given field. Contacts with his handler were governed by protocols that were operationally thorough and interpersonally sparse. Ivan was not a friend. Ivan was a function, the living connection between Jack Barsky's American life and the Moscow organization that had sent him there. Their meetings were brief and followed fixed procedures evolved over years of Soviet illegal operations, procedures designed to ensure that the meeting itself would leave no record that could later be used to trace either party. A typical contact cycle operated like this. Moscow would send a signal to indicate that a meeting was desired, transmitted via shortwave radio in an encoded format that Jack received on a small radio set kept in his apartment. The broadcast listened to at a predetermined time on a predetermined frequency. The decoded message would specify a location, always a public place, a park, a busy commercial street, a museum, and a time. He would arrive at the location and execute a surveillance detection run first, a circuitous route through the surrounding streets designed to establish whether he was being followed, a procedure that had to be done carefully and naturally, which meant behaving at all times like someone who was simply moving through the city with ordinary purpose. If the run was clean, he would proceed to the meeting. The meetings themselves rarely lasted more than a few minutes. Information was passed in both directions: operational updates, collection priorities from Moscow, practical queries about his establishment progress, any materials that needed to be passed physically. A brush pass in a busy area could transfer a folded document or a small object in a contact so brief and so natural in appearance that surveillance cameras, had they been common in that era, would have found nothing to flag. They were not friends catching up. They were professionals completing a transaction, and the efficiency of the transaction was itself a form of professional respect. Moscow's collection priorities for him in this early period were primarily intelligence about American political and economic conditions, gathered through the normal accumulation of open-source material: newspapers, trade publications, public government documents that a positioned observer could synthesize into reporting that held value for analysts back in Moscow, not because it contained secrets, but because it represented an informed American civilian perspective filtered through analytical intelligence. The Directorate's program's conception of what an illegal could provide was sophisticated in this sense. It understood that not all valuable intelligence was classified, and that an agent with good judgment and strong analytical training, embedded in the right professional and social environment, could produce reporting of genuine value through observation and synthesis rather than through theft. But Moscow also wanted more, and he understood that the years of establishment work were an investment with a specific expected return. As his legend deepened and his professional position improved, the collection priorities would sharpen. He would be expected to develop relationships with people who had access to sensitive material, to position himself near the information the KGB's technical and strategic programs needed, to find ways of drawing the intelligence out of those environments without triggering the security awareness that had been heightening steadily throughout the 1970s in the wake of high-profile Soviet espionage cases. He understood all of this. He accepted it as the terms of the arrangement he had entered. What he had not been fully prepared for, what the years of Moscow training, for all their thoroughness, had addressed in theory but could not simulate in practice, was the cumulative psychological effect of the daily performance. Not on individual days when the discipline held without significant effort, but over months and years, as the performance became the totality of his social existence, as every interaction with every person in his daily environment operated on the same fundamental premise of concealment. He was very good at it. The evidence for that is the 10 years it worked without detection. But good at it is not the same as unaffected by it. What the performance cost him accumulated quietly, out of sight even to himself, in the same way that compound interest accumulates gradually, then suddenly and always more than you were expecting when you finally thought to count. For now, though, in those first years the operation was running cleanly. The legend was holding. The work was progressing. Jack Barsky was becoming, day by practical day, exactly who the KGB had spent 7 years training him to be. There is a particular science to invisibility, and it is not, as popular imagination tends to suggest, primarily about disguise. The spy of fiction wears different coats, changes his hair, speaks in different accents, moves through the world as a sequence of assumed visual identities. The actual intelligence professional operating in deep cover understood that this kind of theatrical transformation was precisely what got people caught. Disguise drew attention to the act of concealment. What succeeded over the long term was something far more demanding and far less dramatic. The complete and sustained normality of a person who had no reason to be noticed, no reason to be remembered, and no reason to be questioned. The KGB's illegals program had arrived at this understanding after decades of accumulated operational experience, some of it paid for in the failure and imprisonment of people who, for all their ability, had somehow flared into visibility in the wrong moment. Jack Barsky's tradecraft, the specific techniques and protocols by which he maintained his connection to Moscow while living as an ordinary American in New York, was both an extension of this principle and an elaborate practical mechanism that had to operate flawlessly year after year, in the uncontrolled environment of one of the world's most densely surveilled cities. The Federal Bureau of Investigation ran counterintelligence operations in New York continuously, and the New York field office was specifically resourced for Soviet intelligence activity in a city that the KGB regarded as one of its primary operating environments in the United States. The Soviet intelligence presence in New York, operating through the United Nations mission and the Soviet consulate on East 67th Street, was extensive, and the FBI's coverage of it was correspondingly intensive. The genius of the illegal's position was that none of this coverage touched him. The FBI was watching known or suspected Soviet intelligence officers operating under official diplomatic cover. Jack Barsky was, in every formal sense, not that. He had no connection to any Soviet diplomatic installation. He did not attend events at the Soviet consulate or take calls from people with Russian accents. His social circle was American, his employer was American, his bank account was American, his driver's license was American. There was literally no thread connecting him, in any system that the FBI monitoring of Soviet intelligence would examine, to the operation that employed him. He was invisible not because he was hiding, but because he was not in the categories that anyone was looking for. The communication architecture that maintained his operations linked to Moscow was built on this same principle of category separation. The most critical tool was the shortwave radio receiver. He kept in his apartment a modest commercial set that looked, to any visitor who might notice it, like the possession of a radio enthusiast, which was a plausible enough hobby. At a predetermined time, on a predetermined frequency, Moscow broadcast encoded messages in the standard number station format. A voice, synthetic or human, reading sequences of numbers in a steady cadence against a background of static. To anyone tuning randomly across the shortwave band, it sounded like one of hundreds of similar broadcasts produced by intelligence services on multiple sides of the Cold War. To Jack Barsky, with his one-time pad and his training in the decryption procedure, each sequence resolved into specific instructions, identifications, and communications. The one-time pad was the cryptographic mechanism that made these communications theoretically unbreakable. A one-time pad is exactly what it sounds like. Each page of key material is used once and only once to encode a single message. Because each key is random and is never reused, there is no mathematical pattern that a codebreaker can exploit. The only way to break a message enciphered with a one-time pad is to have the pad itself, and the only copies of Jack Barsky's pads were in his possession and in the hands of the Moscow Signal staff preparing the broadcasts. The pads themselves, printed on flash paper, the kind that burns to ash completely when ignited, were stored in a concealment that his apartment contained, a space designed to be accessible quickly but not discoverable readily, of the type that KGB technical services had developed into a precise craft. Dead drops formed the other primary channel. These were the physical exchange points, locations in New York City where he could place or retrieve material, money, or instructions without meeting his handler directly. The tradecraft principles governing dead drops were thorough and non-negotiable. A drop site was selected for its combination of accessibility, plausibility, and covertness. A location where either party could appear without that appearance being remarkable, where the deposit or retrieval of a small object could be accomplished without being observed, and where the site itself would not draw attention through any feature of its physical location. Central Park offered several suitable locations, as did Queens, where the density and variety of urban activity provided adequate cover for the movements involved. A loose brick at the base of a wall, a hollow space beneath a particular park bench, a location defined by specific coordinates against identifiable landmarks, so many steps north of the bridge, so many east of the tree line, memorized rather than written down. The signal protocols that activated a drop were carried in everyday objects made to serve extraordinary purposes. A chalk mark on a specific wall, a mark so ordinary that hundreds of passers-by would see and instantly not register it told him a drop was active. A thumbtack placed in a corkboard at a public location meant a contact meeting was necessary rather than a drop exchange. A specific advertisement in a New York newspaper, of a type so routine that only someone who knew to look for it would see anything in it at all, served as an emergency communication channel. The whole system was designed around the principle that its individual components were invisible because they were unremarkable, not invisible because they were hidden. Moscow's collection requests during the early 1980s, as his legend matured and his professional position improved, had evolved from the general intelligence synthesis of his early operational period into something more targeted. The Soviet intelligence apparatus of this era had specific and pressing interests in American technological development, particularly in areas that bore on the strategic balance between the two superpowers. The revolution in computing that was reshaping American industry and government alike was of particular interest. As Jack Barsky built his career in the technology sector, he had transitioned from the manual labor of his early settlement years through his continuing education into technical and eventually corporate roles. His proximity to certain categories of information increased. He was not a classic technical intelligence collector in the sense of someone photographing classified documents in a government facility. His access was corporate rather than governmental, and the material he reported on was commercial and industrial rather than classified military. But the KGB understood, better than many Western analysts of the period acknowledged, that the line between commercial technology and military application in America was not as bright as it appeared. The computing capabilities being developed in American corporations in the early 1980s had direct strategic relevance, and an informed observer embedded in that environment, reporting regularly and with analytical depth, was gathering material of genuine value. His reporting was conveyed to Moscow through the dead-drop channel, in written form on the flash paper that left no trace when destroyed, enciphered before placement. The reports themselves were compact and analytical rather than voluminous. Moscow's instructions had always been clear that quantity was a secondary virtue, and that a tightly argued, precisely written assessment of a specific situation was worth considerably more than pages of unanalyzed raw material. He had the analytical training to produce what was needed, and the professional credibility, built genuinely through years of legitimate work, to give his reporting the texture of lived insider knowledge rather than the thin quality of material gathered at arm's length. If you had watched him on any ordinary business day during this period, meeting with colleagues, eating lunch in a midtown restaurant, taking the subway home in the evening with the newspaper folded in his briefcase, you would have seen a man who appeared fully and unremarkably present in the life he was living. His English was not merely functional. It was fluid, idiomatic, unmarked. His cultural references were American. His habits were American. He watched baseball and had opinions about it. He argued about New York City real estate, which in the early 1980s was beginning its long ascent from the devastated lows of the late 1970s, in the way that every New Yorker with any practical interest in the question argued about it. He had colleagues who considered him a friend or something close to it, people who had shared meals with him and told him things about themselves in the way that people do with someone they consider trustworthy. And this is where the story of Jack Barsky diverges most fundamentally from the spy novel version of what a KGB illegal was supposed to be. The spy novel version is a person who perceives their human environment from outside it, a predator moving through a field of targets. What actually happened to him, which he has described with striking honesty in subsequent accounts, was that the environment began to penetrate the performance. The American life he was living was real, in the only sense that finally matters. It was what was actually happening to him, while his Soviet identity was increasingly an abstraction, a historical fact about his origin that had less and less to do with the person he was each day. This erosion of the boundary between performance and performer did not happen all at once. It happened the way that any deep change happens, imperceptibly, through accumulation. Each day in which the American life felt more real than the Soviet abstraction was one more layer of sediment added to a geological formation that was, slowly and then decisively, becoming something that resisted being shifted. Moscow, for the time being, noticed none of this. Moscow received its reports, sent its instructions, and maintained the communication architecture through which it directed its asset in New York. From Moscow's perspective, the operation was running well. The agent was established, productive, and reliable. The investment was paying returns. The mission continued. What Moscow could not see, what the dead drops and the shortwave broadcasts and the brush passes could not transmit, was the particular quality of a Tuesday evening in a Brooklyn apartment when the radio was playing something American and good, and the man listening to it was no longer performing being at home. He was home. And he was beginning, without fully acknowledging it yet, to understand what that meant. He met her in the early 1980s, in the way that people in cities meet, through proximity and repetition and the slow accumulation of small interactions that one day, without any clear announcement, tip over from casual acquaintance into something neither party had planned. Her name was Penelope, and she was an American woman in her late 20s, working in a clerical role at a business near the neighborhood where he had by this time established a more settled domestic life. She was warm in the particular way that some people are warm genuinely, without performance, the kind of openness that invites conversation because it telegraphs convincingly that the invitation is real. He knew, with the professional clarity that his training had embedded so deeply it operated below conscious thought, that romantic involvement was a problem. Moscow's protocols on this subject were explicit. An agent as deeply placed as he was could not permit himself the kind of sustained personal intimacy that a serious relationship required, because serious relationships produced exactly the conditions that made operational security most difficult to maintain. A partner who lived with you, who knew your daily rhythms, who noticed inconsistencies in your behavior, and had both the intimacy and the standing to ask about them. A partner was the most common vector through which deep cover operations were exposed. Not through deliberate betrayal in most cases, but through the simple, unstoppable logic of human observation. The people who knew you best were also the people most likely to notice when something didn't add up. He knew all of this. He had been taught all of this over years of preparation, with case studies and historical examples that made the point in no uncertain terms. And he allowed the relationship to develop anyway. What happened was not recklessness, and it was not naivety. What happened was the thing his training had prepared him for strategically but had failed to adequately account for at the level of the body, the nervous system, the deep biological programming that governs human attachment regardless of what the conscious mind has decided. He was 31 years old, 5 years into a life of total isolation from genuine personal connection, and the specific quality of loneliness that produced not sharp loneliness, not the acute experience of missing something, but a dull, pervasive absence that had been there so long it had begun to feel like a neutral condition had been wearing at him in ways he had not been allowing himself to register clearly. Penelope was uncomplicated in the ways that mattered most at that moment. She was not connected to his work in any capacity that created institutional risk. She was not politically active in any way that would attract intelligence community attention. She was a private person leading a private life in a large city that accommodated millions of private lives without registering any of them. And she was drawn to him in a way that, when he paid honest attention to it, he recognized as genuine and reciprocal. He constructed a version of himself for her that was Jack Barsky deepened by specifics that could be maintained. The Pennsylvania upbringing, now elaborated with practical details he had rehearsed. The career in technology, which was genuine. The particular mix of intellectual intensity and social reserve that, being based on his actual character, required no performance. She knew him as someone who was private about his past, which in New York, among people who moved to the city from complicated circumstances, was not unusual. She knew him as someone who was thoughtful and present in conversation, who listened carefully, who could be generous with his attention in the specific moments it was needed. These things were not lies. They were the parts of him that were real, offered honestly within the constraint of everything else. What he did not tell her, and this was the lie, not in any individual statement but in the entire structure of what the relationship rested on, was any of what mattered most about who he was. He did not tell her he had been born in East Germany. He did not tell her that his real name was Albrecht Dietrich. He did not tell her that he worked for the KGB, that his social security number had been built on the identity of a dead child, that the man she was developing feelings for was a legal fiction animated by an intelligence operation whose existence she could not have imagined. The relationship grew on a foundation that was, in its deepest structure, false. And he understood this with a precision that was both total and increasingly painful. The pregnancy arrived as a fact about the world before it was anything else, a shift in the physical reality of the situation that preceded and transcended any consideration of what it meant strategically or operationally. She was pregnant. That was real. Whatever else was complicated or uncertain or dangerous about his situation, that was not complicated. That was simply true, and true in a way that demanded something from him that pure strategy could not provide. He told Moscow, The protocol for significant personal developments required him to report anything that altered the operational picture, and an unexpected pregnancy certainly did that. The response from his handlers was predictable given the operational logic. Disengage. The relationship had already created a risk parameter outside the original design of the operation. A child would compound that risk substantially, creating documentary ties, birth certificate, parental relationships, legal and medical records that connected Jack Barsky to a specific woman and a specific child in ways that had ongoing persistence in multiple institutional systems. Moscow's recommendation was that he remove himself from the relationship before the child was born so that the connection could be minimized. He did not follow Moscow's recommendation. His daughter Chelsea was born in 1987, and the decision to be present for that, not just to observe it from a strategic distance but to actually be her father, in the living daily sense of the word, was, in retrospect, the first moment in which his loyalty to the human life he was living clearly overrode his loyalty to the organization that had put him there. He would not have framed it that way at the time. He would have said, and did say, that he was managing the operational risk in a way that was consistent with the mission's long-term interests, because the stability of a settled domestic life was actually a cover advantage rather than a vulnerability, because a man with a family was exactly the kind of person who did not attract the kind of suspicious attention that a solitary, rootless individual might. All of that was technically arguable. But the actual reason he stayed, the reason that became clearer with each passing month of Chelsea's life, with each morning routine and each small discovery of the particular way an infant perceives the world and the particular way it feels to be the person that perception is aimed at, was not strategic. It was the thing that his training had been specifically designed to prevent. He loved his daughter. The feeling was unqualified, unprecedented in his experience, and entirely incompatible with the professional detachment that the operation required. Chelsea grew through her first months and then her first year and then into toddlerhood with the unstoppable momentum that healthy children possess, and he watched this process with an attention that had nothing to do with intelligence work and everything to do with the specific bewilderment that parents describe when they try to explain what the experience is, the way a small person's development simultaneously confirms and dissolves everything you thought you knew about what mattered. He changed her diapers, walked her in the stroller through the Brooklyn streets in the mornings when the day was fresh. He held her when she was sick and felt, with a precision that no amount of analytical training could rationalize into abstraction, that he was holding something irreplaceable. The relationship with Penelope evolved through the complications that any relationship involving an unwanted pregnancy and an emotionally constrained partner tended to involve. There were periods of closeness and periods of distance. The fundamental impossibility of what he was fully present in one sense, permanently absent in another, created frictions that no amount of personal goodwill on either side could entirely resolve. She felt accurately that there were large parts of him she couldn't access. The conversations that stopped at certain points. The questions he deflected rather than answered. The way his attention could go somewhere she couldn't follow without his face showing much of anything. She was not unintelligent. She noticed these patterns. She attributed them to the emotional reticence that she knew some men developed, and to whatever complicated history he had hinted at rather than disclosed. She was not wrong about the emotional reticence, which was real and deep. She simply lacked the specific information that would have allowed her to understand why it was there and how complete it was. The operational picture, meanwhile, was evolving in ways that Moscow watched and Jack Barsky monitored from a different vantage point, with a growing sense of internal contradiction that he was managing less successfully than he would have managed it a year or two earlier. He had a daughter who called him by the name that did not belong to him. He had a life that he had built with genuine labor and genuine investment growing around a lie so total that there was no version of the full truth that could be offered to any person in it without destroying everything. He was, as his handler in Moscow would later describe to him with the clipped efficiency of a performance review, operating well. His cover was solid. His reporting was valued and current. His professional position had advanced to a point where his access was improved from when he had arrived. He also knew, with the part of him that the mission had never fully claimed, that something had changed in the 8 years since he had stepped off the plane at the Canadian border and been waved through into a country that did not know he was coming and would not have permitted his entry if it had. The man who had stood in that boarding house room in 1978, sitting in the orange lamplight and managing the weight of his professional solitude with the tools his training had given him, that man was still here in the obvious sense. But the ground he was standing on was different. The ground had shifted under him quietly over years, the way ground does in a country where it is allowed to shift, where the landscape is not policed by a state apparatus into artificial permanence. The ground he was standing on now was Chelsea's ground. And it was, in every way that finally counted, American. MetLife, in the mid-1980s, was one of the great fixtures of American corporate life, a company so old and so embedded in the fabric of American economic culture that its name and its logo, the Peanuts characters that adorned its advertising with cheerful improbability, had become part of the ambient furniture of the national imagination. It occupied a significant portion of the office real estate around Madison Avenue in Manhattan, and it employed thousands of people in roles that ranged across the full spectrum of insurance and financial services work, from the most senior actuarial analysis down through layers of administrative and technical support. It was precisely the kind of large, stable, bureaucratically structured organization that an intelligence operative needed in order to build a career of credibility and access. It moved slowly enough that a new employee could establish their reliability before being required to produce results that depended on connections not yet made, and it moved in the direction of information that was, from Moscow's perspective, worth being close to. He had joined MetLife in the mid-1980s, transitioning out of an earlier technology role into the company's information technology division, where his computer science credentials and his demonstrated competence with the systems that were rapidly becoming central to corporate operations at every level had made him a useful hire. His path into a stable corporate career had required patience, the years of night school, the early work history that was legitimate but unimpressive in title and compensation, the accumulation of skills and demonstrable reliability that eventually produced something that could pass for a normal working biography. By the time he was sitting in a MetLife office with a business card and a salary and colleagues who knew his name and sometimes ate lunch with him, the legend had the density of the real thing. Not because the underlying documentation had been expanded into some elaborate fabrication, but because years of actual presence in the American workforce had filled in the texture that documentation alone could never provide. He was good at the work. This was both operationally useful and, as the years went on, personally significant in a way he had not anticipated. The intelligence mission required presence, access, and the professional credibility to maintain both. But the work itself was engaging on its own terms. The technical challenges of applying computing systems to large-scale insurance operations were genuine challenges, involving the kind of complex problem-solving that had always engaged him most fully. He thought about code with the same focus he had once brought to chemistry problems, and he brought to the workplace the kind of methodical, patient competence that organizations valued in their best employees. He received positive reviews. He was considered reliable and analytical, someone who could be trusted with complex projects and who delivered results without the drama that some highly capable people required. At the same time, the professional world he was building into was generating exactly the kind of access that Moscow's collection priorities demanded. The corporate information management systems of major American financial institutions in the 1980s were deeply connected to both the regulatory and the technological landscape that the Soviet intelligence apparatus wanted understood. The financial instruments being developed, the computing infrastructure being built, the operational connections between corporate systems and governmental oversight bodies, all of this represented intelligence of a kind that informed Moscow's strategic picture of the American economy at a time when the economic competition between the superpowers was, in certain assessments, as important as the military one. His reporting to Moscow during this period drew on his professional observations without, for the most part, requiring him to access material that was formally classified or to recruit colleagues as sources in any way that created significant security risk. He was an observer and analyst, using the legitimate access that his professional position provided and the analytical training that Moscow had given him to produce reporting that Moscow valued. He was not, in the classic espionage sense, stealing secrets. He was synthesizing open and near-open source material with the analytical depth that raw collection could not provide and conveying it to an organization that had paid a great deal for the ability to receive it. But the internal condition of the man doing all of this was, through the middle 1980s, undergoing a slow and significant transformation that no amount of operational discipline was reversing. He had been thinking about this with the growing honesty that comes when suppression stops being fully effective. The ideology that had carried him from Merseburg to Jena to Moscow to New York had operated, for most of his adult life, as a genuine belief system, not a performance of belief, not a convenient rationalization, but an actual lived framework for understanding the world that had seemed, when he arrived in America, solid. What he found, after years of actually living in the country he had been trained to regard as the organized expression of capitalist exploitation, was something considerably more complicated than the framework had accommodated. The materialism of American life, the abundance, the variety, the sheer wealth of options that ordinary American consumers navigated without apparent consciousness of its extraordinariness, was genuinely striking to someone who had grown up in Merseburg, where the state controlled what was available and the available was never quite enough. But what struck him more deeply was something less concrete: the texture of the freedom. Not freedom in the abstract political sense that ideological debate used the word, but freedom as a practical daily condition, the freedom to move, to speak, to disagree, to be wrong in public without consequences, to change your mind, to argue with authority and not be arrested for the argument. These were not things that the East German state had given to Albrecht Dietrich. They were things that the American state, for all its imperfections, and his analytical mind catalogued the imperfections without romantic softening, extended to Jack Barsky as a matter of course. The Reagan years were a specific context for these observations. The early 1980s had brought a president whose anti-Soviet rhetoric was as sharp as anything the Cold War had produced, whose military buildup was substantially increasing the pressure on the Soviet economy, and whose political project was explicitly and ambitiously aimed at the defeat of communism as a global proposition. From the perspective Albrecht Dietrich had been given in East Germany and Moscow, Reagan was the enemy's commander-in-chief, the embodiment of the imperialist project at its most aggressive. But Jack Barsky, watching Reagan from inside the country that had elected him, watching his colleagues react to the president, listening to Americans argue about him in the way Americans argued about everything, constantly and loudly and with the absolute freedom to reach any conclusion they chose, found a relationship between the American population and their government that was not what the Marxist-Leninist analysis had told him to expect. Americans criticized their government. They did it freely and without consequence. They elected governments they later decided were wrong and then elected something else. The system produced bad outcomes in various dimensions. He could see that clearly and reported on it honestly, but it also produced a society that was, in the dimension of individual liberty, the dimension that he was living in daily rather than analyzing from a theoretical distance, markedly different from what he had grown up in. The difference was not the kind that could be argued away by pointing at America's failures, which were real and which he did not romanticize. It was a structural difference, a difference of fundamental nature, that the ideology he had been given as a young man in Merseburg had not honestly accounted for. He did not have a dramatic crisis of faith. He did not sit down one day and decide that everything he had believed was wrong. What happened was more like a gradual recalibration, a slow shifting of weight from one foot to the other until the center of gravity was no longer where it had started. He continued his work. He filed his reports. He maintained his communication protocols and met his obligations and was, to all outward appearances, a functioning and productive Soviet intelligence operative. But the conviction that had underpinned the whole operation, the genuine belief in the justness of the cause, was taking on the quality of a memory rather than a present reality. Chelsea was 2 years old by the mid-1980s, and his relationship with Penelope had settled into a form that contained genuine affection alongside its genuine complications. He was present in Chelsea's life in a way that surprised him with its completeness. The Saturday mornings with her in the park, the evenings when she was learning to make sounds that would eventually be words, these were not operational calculations. They were the days of his actual life, experienced with a full and unmediated presence that the professional framework he operated within could not reach. He was holding two things simultaneously that were becoming less and less compatible: the mission and the life, the archive and the present, Moscow's project and his own. For years he had managed the tension between them with the expertise of someone trained specifically for that purpose. But expertise at managing a tension is not the same as resolving it, and what had been a managed tension was beginning to accumulate into something that was generating its own pressure, independent of any external event, working from the inside. The reckoning, when it came, would not arrive in the form of an external confrontation. It would arrive from within, through the only door that a man of Jack Barsky's particular construction was susceptible to, the one that his 10 years in America had quietly and permanently opened. The message arrived through the standard channel, decoded from the shortwave broadcast at the predetermined time on the predetermined frequency, and it was, in its content, unambiguous. Moscow was recalling him. The operation was, from Directorate S's perspective, at a point where the investment could be consolidated and the agent returned to the Soviet Union for debriefing and reassignment. The message did not invite discussion. It set out the expectations and the timeline. Jack Barsky was to disengage from his American life, his job, his relationships, his apartment, and arrange his departure. The operational protocols for extraction were detailed, as they always were, with the precision that the KGB brought to security-critical procedures. He was told when. He was told how. He was told what he would be coming back to. He did not come back. The year was 1988. He had been in the United States for 10 years. Chelsea was not yet 2 years old. His position at MetLife was established and advancing. His command of English had, at some point in the previous few years, crossed the line from very good to completely natural. He had stopped thinking in German except occasionally in dreams, a fact he had noted with a professional detachment that did not quite conceal its emotional significance. He had been building, with every day of those 10 years, a structure that was now so substantial that the prospect of dismantling it was not an abstraction. It was a specific and enormous loss, and the specific and enormous nature of that loss was not something the mission had equipped him to treat as a reasonable cost. He was also, by 1988, uncertain enough about the Soviet project itself that the destination was not what it had once represented in his mind. He had been watching the Soviet Union from a distance for a decade, via the analysis he conducted and via the world news that reached him through American media, and what he was watching was not the confident, advancing superpower that his childhood ideology had posited. Mikhail Gorbachev had come to power in 1985 and launched the reforms of Glasnost and Perestroika, which were politically astonishing in their directness about the Soviet system's failures and which were, in the analysis of anyone with a clear understanding of Soviet institutional dynamics, either a genuine attempt to transform the system or a symptom of how thoroughly the system needed transformation. Neither version led to a reassuring picture. A system admitting its failures so publicly was either brave or desperate, and the operational intelligence he processed from the KGB's own communications suggested the latter was closer to the truth. He thought about returning. He gave it the full, honest analytical treatment he gave every significant problem, examining it from multiple angles, assessing the actual outcomes, not the formally stated ones. What would it mean to go back? He would be debriefed thoroughly, which meant yielding everything he knew about his operational methods, his contacts, and the information he had gathered. He would be rehoused in the Soviet Union in whatever capacity the organization determined was appropriate for a return to legal. He would be separated from Chelsea. He would be permanently separated from Chelsea. She was an American citizen, the daughter of an American woman, unable to follow him to Moscow even if taking her were legally possible. The severance would be complete and irreversible. He would also, if he was entirely honest, be returning to a country he no longer believed in. That admission had been building for years, in the way that difficult truths build in the minds of intelligent people who have every incentive to not fully acknowledge them. But the message from Moscow, by forcing the question to a decisive point, had extracted the honest answer. He did not want to go back. Not operationally, not ideologically, not in any dimension in which the question could be examined. What he did instead was something that required a specific kind of cold courage, not the bravado of physical action, but the focused nerve of a man who understood the stakes clearly and chose his course anyway. He sent a message back to Moscow. The message, transmitted through the established secure channel, stated that he was unable to comply with the recall order at this time due to personal circumstances that required his continued presence. The phrasing was careful, not a refusal, technically, but a deferral, and he knew, as he sent it, that Moscow would read it clearly for what it was. Moscow's response was what a trained intelligence professional would expect from an organization that had invested enormously in an asset that was now failing to perform its most basic function, which was obedience. The messages that came back pressed him. They cited the schedule. They cited the operational necessity. They emphasized the expectation that an agent of his position and training understood and accepted the chain of authority that governed his role. They escalated in urgency. And then, eventually, they escalated in tone, in ways that were designed to make the possible consequences of noncompliance concrete in his mind. Among the messages that followed was one that contained a warning about his health. The specific phrasing described a disease. Rabies was the clinical term used, and suggested that if he returned immediately, treatment would be made available. If he did not, the disease would run its natural course. This was not, in the specific lexicon of KGB communications with field assets who had failed to comply with operational instructions, a medical advisory. It was a threat, an asset who refused recall and who represented a security exposure, who knew the methods, the protocols, the communication channels, the identities involved in the operation was a liability. The KGB's history with liabilities of that kind was not ambiguous. He understood the message completely. He decoded it, sat with its implications, and then did something that was either the most sensible or the most reckless thing he had ever done, depending on how you counted the probabilities. He took it and turned it into a tool. He went to a doctor, a real American doctor, a general practitioner he had occasionally consulted for minor medical matters under his Jack Barsky identity, and told him that he had been bitten by a possibly rabid animal some weeks earlier and had not sought immediate treatment, and that he was concerned about what that meant for his health. The doctor was alarmed, as any responsible physician would be. Rabies, once symptomatic, was essentially invariably fatal. The post-exposure prophylaxis that could prevent the disease from developing was effective only when administered before symptoms appeared. The timeline was urgent. What followed was medically real, clinically documented, and entirely on the record. He received the full post-exposure treatment protocol, the immunoglobulin injection, and the series of vaccine doses administered over the following 2 weeks, all of it accurately recorded in an American medical system that generated paper, and all of it entirely verifiable. He then sent Moscow a message informing them that he had been diagnosed with suspected rabies exposure and that he was undergoing treatment, that the situation required him to remain in place, and that his medical status was documented in the American healthcare system in a way that would be legally and forensically traceable if anything happened to him. The performance was elegant in its specific intelligence logic. It used Moscow's own coded language, the rabies warning, to construct a defensive counterthreat. If Moscow moved against him, the documented medical trail in the American system would lead investigators directly into questions about how and when the rabies exposure had occurred, which would in turn lead to questions about his identity and his connections that Moscow had every reason to prevent from being asked. The threat was mutually assured in miniature. If he was harmed, his situation would require explanation. That explanation would cost Moscow more than his continued, non-compliant presence in New York. Moscow withdrew the threat. The messages became less urgent, then more infrequent, then eventually ceased with any regularity. He was, in the organizational terminology, put on hold, an asset that was technically still active but from whom operational value was no longer being extracted, who was being left in place because removing him forcibly was more expensive than his existence cost. This was not a permanent resolution. He understood that clearly. It was a reprieve, bought with a calculated bluff that had cost him very little because the documentation behind it was real, and which had bought him time whose duration he could not predict but whose value was certain. He had to think about what came next. He was still Jack Barsky. He still had his job at MetLife and his apartment and his daughter and his social security number and all the practical infrastructure of a life that was thoroughly, functionally American. He no longer had Moscow's active support. He no longer had the communication architecture that had connected him, for 10 years, to the organization that had put him there. He was, in the intelligent sense of the word, unsupported, an agent operating without a handler, without a mission structure, without the institutional backing that had been the foundation of everything he built. He was also, in the lived sense of the word, free. For the first time in his adult life, for the first time since he had walked through the doors of the Institute in Jena and accepted the proposal that had consumed the next 17 years, he was not accountable to Moscow. The organization that had trained him, inserted him, directed him, threatened him, and then let go of him was no longer the governing condition of his existence. What remained was America. What remained was Chelsea. What remained was the question of how you continue to live as a person whose existence is built on a fiction that cannot be undone without consequences he was not yet prepared to face. He decided, for the time being, to keep going. To be Jack Barsky without Moscow, which was the strangest version of the role and the most honest one. To get up in the morning and take the subway to MetLife and do his job and be the person his daughter called when she needed something. To live inside the fiction for whatever time remained before the fiction came apart. He did not know how long that would be. He knew it would end. The years between 1988 and the early 1990s were, in a certain light, the closest thing to ordinary that his life had ever produced. Moscow was silent. The communication architecture that had governed his existence for a decade had gone dormant. He had no handler to report to, no collection priorities to fulfill, no dead-drop schedules to maintain. He went to work at MetLife and did his job and came home and was present for Chelsea in the ways that a father could be present, and the absence of the operational framework which he had expected to feel as liberation manifested instead as a strange lightness that took time to become comfortable. He thought, in this period, a great deal about what he was. Not in the abstract philosophical sense, but in the very practical sense. What was his situation, assessed honestly? He was a citizen of the German Democratic Republic living under a fraudulent American identity, working in the information technology division of a major American insurance company, father to an American child, legally non-existent in any honest accounting of the relevant documents. He had not been arrested. He was not, to his knowledge, under surveillance. He was, in every observable dimension of his daily life, Jack Barsky, and yet the charge that could potentially be brought against him was not a minor one. Fraud upon the immigration and identity systems of the United States. Espionage, which in the relevant statute carried severe consequences. The specific legal exposure was real and significant, and he was not naive about it. He was also watching the world change in ways that altered the practical shape of that exposure. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. He watched the footage on American television, the same footage that people around the world were watching, crowds of East Germans pouring through checkpoints that had been sealed for 28 years, people climbing the wall and dancing on something that had always been presented as permanent and now was simply rubble underfoot. He watched his country of birth dissolve itself in real time. By 1990, the German Democratic Republic had been absorbed into the Federal Republic of Germany, ending its existence as a state. The country that had produced him, the system that had sent him to Jena and recommended him to the KGB and waved him into a life of total concealment, it was gone. It ceased to exist in October 1990 with a formality that was almost anticlimactic given the drama of what had led to it. The Soviet Union followed. Gorbachev's reforms had released forces that the reforms could not contain, and the process of dissolution that accelerated through 1990 and 1991 was, from the perspective of someone who had spent years being economically and strategically trained to regard the Soviet state as the permanent and invincible anchor of world communism, a profound and disorienting spectacle. In December 1991, Gorbachev resigned and the Soviet Union was formally dissolved. The KGB itself was broken up and reorganized, its functions distributed among successor services, its institutional identity, the one that had recruited him, trained him, sent him, threatened him, and then lost interest in him, simply terminated. The organization that had made him did not exist anymore. This had obvious practical significance. It did not, however, eliminate the legal consequences that his situation contained. The crimes, to the extent they were crimes, had been committed against the United States government, and the United States government did not dissolve when the Soviet Union did. The FBI did not close its counterintelligence divisions because the primary adversary had reorganized itself. The identity fraud was documented in American records regardless of what had happened to the state that had arranged it. He understood this clearly and continued to understand it daily as a background condition of his existence. His personal life during this period was in transition. The relationship with Penelope had, through its accumulated weight of contradiction and incompleteness, reached the point where both parties knew it was ending without either party being able to say exactly when or how. It ended, eventually, as these things do not with a dramatic rupture but with a gradual withdrawal, the warmth reducing over months until the honest temperature of the situation became undeniable. The arrangement surrounding Chelsea's parenting was worked out, as these things have to be worked out, through the practical negotiations of two people who had a child in common and a relationship that was over. He moved out of the shared domestic space and established himself in an apartment in New Jersey, across the Hudson from Manhattan, in an arrangement that made his continued presence in Chelsea's life logistically possible while creating the physical distance that the situation required. New Jersey in the early 1990s was a specific kind of American reality. The suburbs and exurbs of the metropolitan area, the highway commercial strips and the residential streets with their settled, somewhat anonymous quality of American domestic life away from the intensity of the city. He found the distance from New York's concentrated energy both clarifying and slightly lonely, and he noted both things about it without overweighting either. Chelsea visited on weekends. He had a routine with her, the particular rituals that single parents develop with young children, the specific places they return to, the small traditions that children depend on for their sense of continuity and safety. She was happy in his presence in the uncomplicated way of a small child who is simply at home with a parent, and he was happy in her presence in a way that had no operational dimension whatsoever. She was the one relationship in his life that was entirely, simply true. She did not know who he was. She would, in time, have to. But for now, on these weekends in New Jersey, she was just Chelsea, and he was just her father. He was also thinking very carefully about what the rest of his life was going to look like. The question that had been abstract for years, what happens when this ends, was acquiring practical urgency. He was in his early 40s. He had a career and a professional identity and a child and a life that were real in all the ways that mattered for the living of it. He also had a ticking timeline, though he did not know how much time remained. The FBI did not know where he was. To his knowledge, no investigation had reached him. But he was also aware, with the clear-eyed pragmatism that his training had installed as a permanent cognitive habit, that this was a condition that could change, and that its changing would not be announced in advance. He thought about what his options were. He could do nothing, continue as Jack Barsky, hope that the changed post-Cold War landscape had reduced the priority of pursuing Soviet-era intelligence cases, let the situation resolve itself by attrition. He could attempt to regularize his status, seek legal counsel about his situation, and explore whether some arrangement with the authorities was possible, given the extraordinary circumstances and the changed geopolitical context. He could disappear, which was technically possible, construct a new departure from his current legend, rebuild in a third location, start again. He turned each option over with the same methodical patience he brought to everything and arrived at the same conclusion each time. Doing nothing was the only option that allowed Chelsea to remain at the center of his life in the way she had become essential to it. So he did nothing, which is not the same as being passive. He continued to build. He continued to develop his career, which by the early 1990s had reached a level of genuine seniority in the information technology field, allowing him to move beyond MetLife into roles of greater responsibility and compensation at other organizations. He maintained the careful daily practice of being exactly who he appeared to be, not because the KGB required it anymore, but because it was the only way to protect the life he had built and the daughter at the center of it. He paid his taxes. He renewed his driver's license. He voted in local elections, which was legally available to him as a holder of a fraudulent Social Security number, in a way that he recognized was itself an additional complication in the legal picture, but which felt, in the moment of doing it, like the most natural thing in the world. He was also, in a way that was incremental and hard to point to at any specific moment, becoming more clearly American. Not in the legal sense, he was not American in the legal sense. but in the cultural, psychological, habitual sense that national identity actually operates in practice. He thought American thoughts in American English about American problems within an American framework of assumptions about the world. The Germany of his childhood was an extraordinarily distant country, a place he could barely feel the texture of without deliberate effort. The Soviet Union that had shaped the most consequential years of his adult life was a historical entity. America was what was actually happening, and it had been what was actually happening for long enough that it no longer felt like a situation he was managing. Felt like who he was. A reckoning was coming. He could feel it the way you feel whether changing not yet arrived, but present in the pressure, in the air, in some shift in the quality of the ordinary that precedes the extraordinary. He did not know exactly what form it would take. He knew only that when it came, it would find him where he had been all along. Here, in America, in the life he had chosen over the one he had been assigned. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not publicize the specific mechanism by which it locates deep-cover Soviet intelligence operatives in the United States. The declassified accounts, the court records, and the congressional testimonies available in the public domain describe the outcomes, the arrests, the convictions, the years of investigation, but the exact intelligence tradecraft by which the FBI identified particular targets has, in most cases, remained appropriately protected. What is known about the case of Jack Barsky comes from multiple sources that converge on a basic account. A tip, received by the FBI's New York Counterintelligence Division in the early 1990s, pointed investigators toward an individual whose profile, when examined, raised questions that warranted sustained attention. The tip's origin remains one of the less fully documented aspects of the case in the public record. The most reliable accounts suggest that information from a foreign source almost certainly related to the broader intelligence reorganization and partial opening that followed the Soviet Union's dissolution in 1991. A period during which some former Soviet intelligence personnel made contact with Western services and provided varying levels of information about operations that were now, from their perspective, liabilities rather than assets, had helped identify the operational picture that included a deep-cover illegal operating in the New York area under an American identity. This kind of source material, though often fragmentary and requiring extensive corroboration, was among the most operationally valuable intelligence the FBI could receive during this period. It provided the starting point for investigations that open-source work and surveillance alone might take years or decades to develop. Whatever the precise origin, the FBI's New York field office, which had maintained continuous counterintelligence operations against Soviet and post-Soviet intelligence activities throughout this period, received information that pointed toward a former KGB illegal who was believed to be still living in the United States, living as an American citizen, and had declined to return to the Soviet Union when ordered to do so. The information was enough to begin a focused investigation, but not enough initially to identify a specific individual with confidence. It provided a set of characteristics, a time window, a broad geographic area, a professional profile that would require patient matching against the available evidence before they resolved into a specific person. The FBI's counterintelligence investigation that followed was a sustained operation lasting several years, from the early 1990s through to 1997. The methods employed were those standard to long-term FBI surveillance and investigation. Discreet inquiry through various channels, the careful development of leads that the initial intelligence had suggested, the cross-referencing of documentary systems, and eventually, when the investigation had narrowed its focus to a specific individual, physical surveillance. The surveillance was extended and careful, conducted over a period of months by agents trained in the specific techniques required to observe and document without alerting the subject, because alerting the subject was the one outcome that would simultaneously destroy the investigation and signal to the target that it was time to run. He noticed nothing. This is worth pausing on, given that he was a man with 7 years of KGB training in countersurveillance, someone who had been running surveillance detection drills as a professional habit for decades. The FBI surveillance operation was good enough that it ran for the duration it needed to run without triggering the recognition that years of intelligence tradecraft should, in theory, have produced. He went about his daily life, the commute, the office, the weekend time with Chelsea, without registering the persistent professional attention that was accumulating, a documented picture of his routines, his contacts, his movements, and his responses to the various stimuli that surveillance operations use to understand a subject fully before action is taken. What the FBI was building over those years of observation was not merely a file. It was a threat assessment and a decision architecture, an understanding of who Jack Barsky was, what he was capable of, how he was likely to respond to various approaches, and what the risks and benefits of different courses of action looked like given everything the investigation had established. This kind of analysis was specific to the individual in question, and it drove operational decisions in ways that the crude picture of an espionage arrest as a simple confrontation fails to capture. The FBI was not simply looking for evidence. It was building a strategy for the moment of contact that was designed to produce the outcome it most needed: cooperation. The agents who had studied Jack Barsky for years understood several things about him that the investigation had surfaced. They knew he had a daughter, and they understood what that meant about his priorities. They knew he had refused Moscow's recall order and had been living without operational support for the better part of a decade, which told them something about his commitment to remaining in the United States. They knew that the Soviet Union, whose cause the KGB had recruited him to serve, had ceased to exist, which altered the ideological landscape of the case in ways that distinguished it from a current active Soviet intelligence operation. They had a picture of a man who had, through the specific choices of the previous decade, effectively defected in place, who was still technically the asset the KGB had made him, operating under a fraudulent identity, but who had no active Soviet organizational connection and had made choices over years that reflected a functional alignment with American interests rather than against them. This assessment shaped the approach that the FBI chose to take when it finally moved. The day they came was a May morning in 1997. He was at his home in Mount Olive, New Jersey, where he had been living for several years in a house that represented the most settled domestic arrangement he had managed since arriving in America. The knock on the door came in the morning, and when he opened it, the two people standing there identified themselves as FBI agents and told him he needed to come with them. He told himself, in the moment the door opened, that this was always how it ended. He had known, in the abstract way that he had always known things that he had no immediate intention of acting upon, that this day existed somewhere in the future. The surprise was not that it had arrived. The surprise was that after years of carrying the knowledge of its eventual arrival, the actual arrival produced something he had not predicted. Not panic, not the trained professional response of an intelligence operative confronting interception, but something much quieter and much more complex. A kind of relief. Not relief that he was caught. Relief that the carrying was over. He went with them. He said almost nothing on the drive to the FBI field office. He sat in the room they put him in and looked at the table and the two-way mirror that was the standard furniture of such rooms, and he thought about Chelsea. The specific thought was not strategic or legalistic. It was simply her face at the age she was then, with the particular expression she had when she was concentrating on something, a book, a game, something that required her full attention, and the specific quality of that image was the thing that filled the room, more completely than anything the agents across the table were going to say to him. They were professional and they were thorough. They knew more than he had expected them to know, which told him the investigation had been more advanced and more careful than surveillance of his immediate routine would alone have produced. They knew about his East German origin. They knew about his training. They knew about the period of active operations. They asked questions designed to establish the full scope of what he had done and what he knew, and they asked them with a measured directness that made clear they were not guessing. He made a decision in that room, and it was a decision he had, in some sense, been making incrementally for years, and which the KGB's refusal to fully claim him had made structurally available in a way it might not otherwise have been. He decided to cooperate, not because cooperation was tactically optimal in a narrow prisoner's dilemma calculation, though it happened to be. Not because he had no choice, though his choices were, in the room, genuinely limited. He decided to cooperate because the country he had been spying against was the country where his daughter lived and the country where his real life had been built, and the calculation that had governed every decision he had made since 1988 pointed in one direction and one direction only, toward the thing that kept him here. He told them what they needed to know. He told them about the KGB's methods, the operational protocols, the communication architecture, the training program, the scope of his collection activities. He told them about the specific information he had reported and the specific channels through which it had been conveyed. He told them things that turned out to be genuinely useful to the FBI and CIA analysts who were, in the early post-Soviet period, working to reconstruct the full picture of Soviet illegal operations in the United States, a picture whose gaps included, until Jack Barsky filled them in, details about programs and methods that had never before been described from the inside. The interrogations ran over multiple sessions across days and weeks, and in the process of them, he came to understand that the people asking the questions were not performing a pro forma exercise. They were doing exactly what he was doing, working toward a conclusion that served the interests they were charged with protecting. The intersection of their interests and his interests, Chelsea, America, the continued life that depended on both, turned out to be sufficient for a working arrangement, though the legal framework that would formally establish that arrangement would take longer to construct. He was not immediately arrested in the conventional sense. He was processed and then released to continue his daily life under conditions that were tightly controlled and actively monitored, while the FBI and relevant government attorneys worked through the complex legal picture of his situation. He went home that evening to the house in Mount Olive, and he sat in the kitchen, and he understood that the life that had been operating on borrowed time for 9 years had just had its debt called in. What form the repayment would take, and what would remain afterward, was not yet clear. But he was still in America. Chelsea was still his daughter. That much, at least, was on the right side of the accounting. The formal legal processing of Jack Barsky's case was as unusual as the case itself. The Department of Justice, working with the FBI and the relevant intelligence community partners, faced a situation that had no clean precedent in the existing framework for handling Soviet espionage cases. The standard trajectory for a Soviet intelligence operative caught operating in the United States was arrest, prosecution, and the hard sentencing that reflected the gravity of the offense. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg had been executed. Aldrich Ames received life without parole. Robert Hansen received 15 consecutive life sentences. The counterintelligence community understood the strategic necessity of a deterrence posture, and the deterrence posture required visible and severe consequences. But Jack Barsky's case loaded differently onto that framework in several significant ways, and the differences were not trivial. He had declined to return to the Soviet Union when ordered to do so, which was, from an intelligence community perspective, the single most important fact about him, because it meant he was, in the most practical sense, a man who had already chosen America over the organization that had made him. He had provided, upon apprehension, a cooperation that was genuine and thorough and operationally valuable to an extent that the interrogating agencies assessed as significant. The Soviet Union no longer existed. The KGB in the form that had employed him had been dissolved and reorganized. The specific operational threat that an active Soviet illegal represented had materially changed in the years since his insertion, and the value of the information he could provide was higher, in the post-Cold War intelligence environment, than the value of his prosecution as a deterrent. There was also Chelsea, not as a legal factor but as a human factor, which sometimes and in certain cases is permitted to have weight. The FBI officials who had spent years understanding the man they were investigating had understood who he was as a father, and the lawyers and officials who worked through the case had access to that picture. A prosecution that resulted in imprisonment would separate Chelsea from the parent she knew, at an age when that separation would be the defining fact of her childhood, and in a case where the offenses in question had been committed in service of an organization that no longer existed, against a state whose interests were served more by the cooperation than by the incarceration. These were the calculations that shaped what happened next. The arrangement that was reached through negotiation between his legal representation and the relevant government parties placed him under a supervision framework that allowed him to remain in the United States, living his life at liberty, in exchange for the continuing provision of intelligence information and the acceptance of restrictions and monitoring conditions that the agencies required. He was required to be available for debriefing, to answer questions about matters within his knowledge, and to report any contact with foreign intelligence services or personnel. He agreed to these terms, which were the terms of a cooperation rather than a capitulation, in the sense that both parties were receiving something of value. The debriefings that followed were extensive and ran over a period of years, not simply a one-time accounting of everything he knew, but an ongoing relationship with elements of the intelligence community that used his knowledge as a resource against which developing information could be tested and elaborated. He knew the KGB's illegal program from the inside. He knew its training methods, its operational protocols, its communication architecture, its selection criteria, its organizational culture. In the early post-Soviet period, when Western intelligence agencies were working intensively to understand the scope and nature of the Soviet program that had been running against them for decades, an individual who could answer specific questions from lived experience rather than intercepted documentation or theoretical reconstruction was extremely valuable. He cooperated fully. This was not a transaction he performed reluctantly. He has described it in subsequent accounts as something that felt, by the time it occurred, like an alignment between who he was and what he was doing the first time in his adult life, that those two things had been in the same direction rather than at angles to each other. For 30 years he had been performing, in the deepest sense of the word, performing as a communist, performing as an American, managing the space between two identities that could never fully occupy the same person simultaneously. The cooperation asked him, for the first time, to simply be what he had become and tell the truth about how he had gotten there. It was an easier ask than it might have appeared from outside. During the years of cooperation, he continued to live his life in New Jersey. He had another relationship, which would eventually become a marriage, to a woman named Shauna who had her own practical resilience and who engaged with the complexity of his history with a directness that he found both alarming and, over time, deeply clarifying. She was the first person in his immediate personal environment who knew the full truth, not the operational details, which remained restricted, but the biographical truth, the full account of who Albrecht Dietrich was and what Jack Barsky had been made to do and why he had chosen the path that had led, eventually, here. Knowing that she was in possession of the full picture and continued to regard him as a person she wanted to build a life with was a specific kind of gift, the significance of which he did not take lightly. Chelsea was told, in the years following the arrest, a version of the truth calibrated to her age and her capacity to process it. This was not deception. It was the age-appropriate honesty that parents extend to children who need to understand something too large for full immediate comprehension, the acknowledgement that something real had happened, that her father was not who he had appeared to be on his documents, that the situation was complicated but that the most important thing was also simple. He was her father and he was staying. The full complexity of what that meant, she would come to understand over years, as she grew into the maturity to receive it and as he became capable of offering it with the honesty it deserved. His legal status remained for some years in the uncertain territory of informal arrangement, tolerated presence under monitored conditions, without the formal regularization that citizenship or permanent residence would have provided. The extraordinary cooperation he had provided, and the sustained relationship with the intelligence community that had developed from it, eventually supported a pathway through this uncertainty. The lawyers who worked on his immigration status navigated a process that had no obvious template but that the relevant agencies had interests in seeing resolved, because a person whose continued liberty and stability depended on informal goodwill was a different kind of asset from one whose status was settled and whose life could proceed on a normal basis. He was granted lawful permanent residency first and then, in due course, citizenship. The citizenship ceremony is a public ritual in the American system, a room full of people from across the world, raising their right hands and repeating the oath of allegiance to the Constitution and the United States, completing the formal legal transformation from applicant to citizen. He has described his own citizenship ceremony without the irony that might, from outside, seem appropriate, because from inside the experience it did not feel ironic. It felt like an ending and a beginning at once, the final formal acknowledgement of something that had been true in the lived sense for a very long time already. He became an American citizen formally and legally under the name Jack Barsky because that was the name his entire American life was recorded under, the name Chelsea knew him by, the name his professional history was attached to, the name that was, in every practical dimension, his. The legal complications of the name itself, the fact that it had originated as a fraudulent appropriation of a dead child's identity, were part of the record that the government agencies which had processed his case were aware of and had accommodated within the framework of his unusual situation. The name stayed. Albrecht Dietrich, in the legal sense, was still alive in Germany, though the Germany that had issued his original documents had ceased to exist. The two identities continued to coexist as historical facts, both real, both his, neither one reducible to the other. He also reconnected, during these years, with his family in Germany, or rather, in the reunified Germany that had emerged from the merger of East and West in 1990. His parents had lived not knowing where he was for decades. His father Horst had died without knowing. His mother, Gertrude, had been told only that her son had been working in a classified state role, and then, as the GDR collapsed, had been left with no explanation at all, simply the absence of a son who had not been in contact for 20 years or more. The reunion, when it eventually came, carried the specific weight of all the time that had been lost, the weight of 2 decades of unanswered questions, and the specific grief of a parent who has not known whether their child is alive or dead. He wrote to her first, then called. They met in person, eventually, in Germany. He has described these reunions with the careful emotional precision of someone who is not prone to sentimentality, but who recognizes that certain things are large enough to deserve honest acknowledgement. She was his mother. He had been her son before he was anyone's asset, and the years between the train platform in Jena and the kitchen table in reunified Germany were years that could not be recovered, but whose loss could be acknowledged between two people who were still, despite everything, recognizably the same people who had said farewell at a train station a very long time ago. The intelligence community cooperation eventually moved toward a settled relationship rather than an ongoing operational one. He provided what he knew. The years passed. The Cold War remained in the history books. The agencies that had apprehended and then employed him moved their attentions fully toward the new threat landscape that the post-Soviet world had produced. Jack Barsky became, in their files, a closed chapter, a case resolved, unusually but effectively, through cooperation rather than prosecution, providing intelligence value that the record assessed as significant against the legal exposure that had been formally acknowledged but ultimately set aside in service of the practical outcome. He remained in New Jersey. He continued working, adapting his career as the technology landscape changed around him in the ways it had been changing since before he arrived in America. He was a father and a husband and a professional and a person who had lived, across a single lifetime, more versions of the same fundamental human experience, the experience of becoming someone than almost anyone he was likely to encounter. He was, in every way that a person can be assessed as the thing the word means, an American. There is a book that Jack Barsky published in 2017, titled Deep Undercover, which is his own account of the life described in these pages. It is a document of unusual interest not because it reveals operational details that intelligence professionals had not already documented from their own investigations, but because of the quality of attention he brings to the inner dimension of what he lived through, the way he describes the ideology of his youth not as something he was foolish to have believed, but as something he came to understand fully only after leaving it behind, which turns out to be the only honest way to describe how belief actually works in a person who has genuinely held it. He was not stupid for believing what he believed. He was a product of the world that had produced him, as all of us are products of the worlds that produce us, and the difference between his case and the ordinary case is only that the world that produced him was designed, with unusual intentionality, to produce exactly the person it needed. Since the publication of the book, he has spoken extensively in interviews, at public events, for documentaries, in the kinds of long-form conversations that the age of podcasts and extended journalism has made available in ways that earlier formats did not permit. He became, through these appearances, something that neither Albrecht Dietrich nor Jack Barsky, the KGB asset, could have imagined being. A public figure, a man who stood in front of audiences and told the full truth about the double life he had lived, and who discovered that the full truth, told plainly, was received with a kind of fascinated compassion that he had not expected and did not know initially what to do with. The questions he gets are consistent in their preoccupations. Did he feel guilty about what he had done? The honest answer is that he felt it in stages and with a precision that shifted over time, guilt about specific people and specific deceptions rather than about the operation in the abstract, because the abstract had been constructed to prevent exactly the kind of personalized moral accounting that makes guilt function. The personalized accounting came later, and when it came through the specific faces he had known rather than through any grand ideological reckoning. Penelope, Chelsea. the colleagues he had worked alongside for years who had thought they knew him, the woman who had been his mother in Germany, sitting in her apartment not knowing whether her son was alive. The small human injuries of a grand strategic operation, which were not small to the people who received them. Does he still speak Russian? He does. Does he still think of himself as German? In some dimension, yes, the dimension where identity is formed by language and early formation and the specific smell and texture of a particular kind of childhood, which is not something that subsequent choices entirely revoke. He is American in every practical and legal and, he maintains, moral sense. But the boy from Merseburg is still there, somewhere in the deep background of who he is. The way the key you learned first is still available in the muscles even when you have been playing in a different key for decades. Chelsea grew into an adult who has engaged with the truth about her father with what observers have described as remarkable maturity and, in time, a kind of pride that is specific to people who discover that the parent they thought they knew contained more than they had realized, more capacity, more experience, more complexity, more endurance. She has appeared with him publicly. She has spoken about him in interviews with the particular effect of someone who has processed something very large and arrived, through the processing, at a genuine understanding rather than a performed one. She is an American woman whose father turned out to be a KGB spy, who loved her enough to refuse an order from Moscow rather than leave, and whose entire subsequent life was shaped by that refusal. She has had years to think about what that means. She thinks it means something good. The legacy of the Jack Barsky case in the intelligence community is specific and well regarded. The cooperation he provided, during the years when the FBI and CIA were working to understand the full scope of the Soviet illegal program, contributed materially to the reconstruction of methods, protocols, and operational particulars that had not been available from any other source. The KGB's Directorate's illegal program was, by all historical assessments, one of the most sophisticated and most expensive components of Soviet foreign intelligence. It consumed enormous resources in training and preparation, inserted a relatively small number of very carefully chosen people into target territories, and achieved a level of sustainability in those placements that technical intelligence and diplomatic cover operations could not match. Understanding how it worked from the inside, how the training was structured, what the communications architecture looked like in practice, how the legend-building process operated at each stage was genuinely useful to the services responsible for detecting any continuation of similar programs by successor Russian intelligence services. The Russian SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service that emerged from the ruins of the KGB's Foreign Intelligence Directorate, has continued to operate illegal programs against the United States in the decades since Barsky's cooperation. The 2010 illegals program arrests the case that resulted in the prosecution of 10 Russian intelligence illegals who had been living under assumed American identities. The case that included Anna Chapman and 9 others who were expelled in a spy swap demonstrated that the methods Barsky had described had not been retired, only revised. The FBI's investigation of the 2010 program drew on an institutional understanding of illegal operations that had been built, in part, from exactly the kind of inside knowledge that cooperating former illegals had provided. The tradecraft insights are never simple to apply because the tradecraft keeps evolving, but the foundational understanding matters, and the foundational understanding was, in some measure, contributed by the man from Merseburg who had declined to go home. In the broader history of Cold War espionage, his story occupies a place that is genuinely distinct from the standard categories. The defector, someone who crosses from one side to the other through a conscious, deliberate act of political or personal choice, usually at a single decisive moment, is a well-documented figure. The trapped spy, someone caught operating against the country that discovers them, prosecuted, imprisoned, exchanged, is an even more familiar type. Jack Barsky does not fit cleanly into either category. He defected without defecting over years, through an accumulation of choices, each of which was individually defensible on strategic grounds but which collectively amounted to a total reorientation of loyalty. He was caught but not imprisoned, prosecuted but not in the conventional sense, because the situation he presented was sufficiently unusual that the conventional frameworks did not accommodate him without modification. What makes his case compelling, beyond the operational drama of it, is the human question it poses and refuses to answer simply. Can a person who was built, deliberately and thoroughly, to be something they were not become something genuine? Can a fiction, lived long enough and believed deeply enough and built honestly enough from the bottom up, become a reality? The official answer from every American institution that has formally engaged with his case seems to be yes, he was granted citizenship, he was accorded the cooperation agreement, he was permitted to remain. The lived answer, from the way he moves through his daily life and the way he talks about the country he chose by refusing to leave it, also seems to be yes. But there is a third version of the question that is more elusive and more interesting. Not whether Jack Barsky became real, but whether Albrecht Dietrich ever stopped being real. The answer here is less clear, and he is honest about the ambiguity. He is both. He has always been both. The two names, the two biographies, the two countries, the two languages, the two complete sets of cultural formation, they coexist in the same person, not in conflict exactly, but in the kind of productive tension that defines someone who has lived with unusual fullness across an unusual range of human experience. He is in his 70s now, living in the United States. He goes to church, which is a detail that tends to surprise people who encounter him through the lens of his former career, but which makes a kind of internal sense to those who understand the full arc of what he has lived. A man who spent decades operating in a world that had no room for transcendence, finding, in the settled latter half of his life, that the room was actually there and had been available all along. He speaks publicly about faith with the same measured directness that he brings to everything else, not with the converting enthusiasm of the recently found, but with the calm of someone who has arrived at a position through long thought and is content to occupy it honestly. The city of New York, which received him as a stranger in 1978 and held him, through all the years of his double life and the years since, without ever asking who he actually was, continues in its perpetual motion. The boroughs where he lived and worked in those early years have changed beyond recognition. The South Bronx has rebuilt itself. Brooklyn has been transformed by the same forces of urban investment and gentrification that have redrawn every American city in the past 30 years. And the Manhattan that he navigated as a new arrival no longer exists in the form he knew. The country he chose, or that chose him by refusing to let him be called back, has continued to be the complicated, enormous, frustrating, generative thing it was when he arrived. He has continued to be part of it. The brass milk boxes and the shortwave radios and the one-time pads and the chalk marks on the walls are the tradecraft of a specific Cold War moment that has passed. The lesson they carry has not passed. The man who grew up in Merseburg and was trained in Moscow and stood at the Canadian border one morning in 1978 with a dead child's name on his documents and an entire fabricated life ahead of him, and who chose, at the moment of decision, the life that was actually happening over the one he had been sent to perform, understood something that required everything he had been through to fully comprehend. You cannot be loyal to an abstraction and a person at the same time, when the two are pointing in opposite directions. Sooner or later, you have to choose one of them. And the choice, once made and sustained through years of everything that followed, tells you more about who you are than anything that was decided for you before you were asked. Jack Barsky chose Chelsea. He chose America. He chose the life that had grown up around the fiction until the fiction was indistinguishable from the truth. Whether you call that defection or loyalty or simply being a human being under extraordinary pressure, the answer is the same. It is the story of a man who was supposed to disappear into someone else and found, somewhere in the middle of the disappearing, that he had become himself instead.